I hereby call to order the Morrisville Town Council work session, September 18th, 2018, at 6:30 p.m. Our first of two discussion items, 2A, is the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization presentation. I'm going to pass the microphone to Benjamin Howell.
So with us tonight, we have Alex Rickard, Deputy Director for Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, and he's going to give a brief overview of MPO transportation planning in general, and then a more detailed presentation on the strategic prioritization or SPOT process that NCDOT uses to determine how they're going to fund projects. And through that, we'll also have a little bit of discussion about NC 54 in particular, since I know that is a council priority. So, and with that, I'll let Alex begin.
Thank you. Good evening. Everybody can hear me, I hope? That's right. How's this? Oh, yeah. Very loud. All right. Thank you for having me over. We try to get out to all of our municipality members every 2 to 3 years or so, just give an update on where we are with the MPO, and especially as councils and commissioners turn over, we have new elected officials, so it's always good to have a refresher on what the Metropolitan Planning Organization is, what our tasks are, and of course, strategic prioritization or SPOT is no simple task. It can be rather complicated and involved, so it's always good to get out and talk to folks who aren't on the MPO boards and see this information on a monthly basis. So I know I sent you a ton of slides, I think over 40 slides. I promise I won't go through all of them tonight, but I wanted you to have the information. But please rest assured, if you have any questions, stop me. I'll be happy to cover any questions or answer any questions, and I'll be here as long as you want tonight, but I'll try to get through this information in about 15 to 20 minutes, so I want to be respectful of your time. So we'll go through quickly some background information on the MPO transportation requirements, the work products that Campo provides, and then we'll dive into the prioritization and the NC 54 projects. So just a little background, MPOs are not unique to North Carolina. They're created, established by the federal government, been around since the 1950s. If you can imagine, prior to MPOs, you had a number of large municipal areas, Miami, Los Angeles, New York, where state DOTs were located far away, and all the decisions about transportation in those towns were made in those state offices. So back in the 50s, the Senate got together, created a few laws to establish MPOs to give local governments equal standing or equal say in transportation decisions in those metropolitan areas. So the MPO is set up and governed by local government members. So we have, I'll go through a slide in a minute that shows all of our members. But the main responsibilities for the MPO, the three I want you to get across or take away from tonight. Number one is the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That is our long-range plan. You may have heard that referred to as the LRTP at some point. That plan goes out 20 years, covers all modes of transportation, and most importantly is that last bullet that says the MTP revenues must match the project cost. They must balance. So as a component of our MTP, we have a revenue or a financial forecast that we show the federal government how much funding we anticipate to have over the next 20 plus years for transportation. The projects that we put in our plan cannot exceed those revenues. So the cost and the project's revenues have to balance. It is not a wish list. It is what is referred to as a fiscally constrained plan. The TIP, or the Transportation Improvement Program, I'm sure you've all heard the term TIP before. That is essentially the first 10 years of that Metropolitan Transportation Plan. It is the counterpart to what's referred to as the STIP, or the State Transportation Improvement Program. So the TIP is developed by the MPO. It is adopted by our executive board. The STIP is developed and adopted by the state DOT, Department of Transportation, and the Board of Transportation. So any project moving forward with federal or state funding has to be listed in both the TIP and the STIP in terms of scope, cost, and schedule. So if we remove something from the TIP, that project doesn't go forward. It's the means we use to check and balance local government wishes versus state DOT. And then the air quality components, well, that's a whole nother presentation if you want me to come back and get into air quality conformity. Campo started off 1968, I believe, before my time, but it was originally Raleigh and Garner. Over the years, it has expanded as the census redefines the urbanized boundary and we've gone to include all of Wake County and now portions of Granville, Franklin, Harnett, and Johnston counties. A population of a little over 1.2 million. It is the largest MPO in the state of North Carolina in size. We go back and forth with the Charlotte MPO every other year, it seems like, on population. But we are the largest by size, second in population at the moment. 24 member governments, and Go Triangle Board of Transportation member also sits on our executive board. The organization is structured by the executive board, formerly known as our Transportation Advisory Committee, or TAC. It's made up of elected officials, usually the mayor from the municipalities, as well as a county commissioner, board of transportation member, and Go Triangle Board member. The MPO executive board is the governing board of the MPO. That is where the decisions are made. There is a technical coordinating committee. We point out Mayor Weinbrick and Carey is our current chair of the executive committee. Prior to that, Mayor Dick Sears in Holly Springs. Prior to that, Mayor Ronnie Williams from Garner. The technical coordinating committee is made up of MPO staff from the member jurisdictions. The current chair is your Mr. Ben Howell. I believe this is your third year as chair. Good luck with that. The relationship between the executive board and the TCC is somewhat similar to a city council and your planning board. The TCC reviews information, makes recommendations to the executive board, who may or may not take that recommendation and make their own decision. Campo staff, 16 members, or 16 staff members at the moment. We have a few vacancies. Most recently, we've added these 3 Wake Transit positions in the last year or so. Across North Carolina, there are currently 19 MPOs, 18 RPOs, or rural planning organizations. Somewhat smaller organization with similar responsibilities to MPO, but not quite the authority legally that MPOs have. MPOs are children of the state of North Carolina, again, whereas MPOs are set up by the federal government. But the point I wanted to make with this slide is simply, no matter where you are in North Carolina, you are covered by either an RPO or an MPO in transportation planning. So let me get on to the products. The most common that you'll see in your agenda packets and other informations from MPO staff would be the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Again, that is our regional blueprint or master plan for transportation over the next 20 plus years. I go back and say that it must be fiscally constrained, so those revenues and costs have to balance. Beyond the funding element, so that's for us, the current plan is 2045. We go out 3 decades. That plan is organized in the projects by 2025, the projects by 2035, and the projects by 2045. Those 3 funding decades. Beyond 2045, we don't have to show our revenue. That's sort of an unfunded element of the MTP referred to as the CTP, or Comprehensive Transportation Plan. It is essentially everything that we need today but can't fund through 2045. The TIP, as I mentioned, is the first 10 years of the MTP. It's updated every 2 years. This is what feeds, or the SPOT program feeds, and this is also the counterpart to the State Transportation Improvement Plan. You may sometimes see reference to the Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP. That is Campo's operating budget and work program for next year. So if you need a new corridor study, a new intersection analysis, any new work from Campo, you're asking Ben and other staff members to submit that to Campo. We try to put that in our work program for next year. The mayor and the other executive board members usually vote on that budget and work program in the February-March timeframe every year. So, moving on, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, as I mentioned, updated every 4 years. By law, has to go out at least every 20 years. The slide or the graphic over here to the right, you're looking at sort of a pyramid, everything that builds up into the 2040 MTP. You see, 2045, excuse me. On the bottom left, you're seeing the local transportation plans. You see the corridor studies. You see local land use plans. That's sort of the bottom tier infrastructure that goes into developing the MTP. Again, we have 24 member governments. Everyone has their own transportation plan. Everyone has their own bike ped plan, transit plan, land use plan. One of our jobs is to take 24 different plans and mash them all together into one regional plan. We try to accommodate those local planning desires as much as possible in a regional context. On lower level or lower order facilities, secondary roads, that's usually easier to do. As we get higher up into the order of highways, interstates and such, that takes on more of a regional context. So it's not always possible to reflect all the desires reflected in local transportation plans. Does that make sense? Let me pause and go back. Any questions on that? So again, to pick on one jurisdiction, you have a local road, a 2-lane road that is a neighborhood road, and you want that road to stay 2 lanes, chances are very high that road's going to stay 2 lanes in the MTP, and so on, right? If we talk about an NC highway or a US highway, well, now it goes beyond just what's in your local plan, but we have to look at what's in your neighbor's plan. We have to look at what's in DOT's long-range plans. We have to take into consideration freight. We have to take in regional mobility issues. As we get into interstates, that becomes even statewide priorities come into play. Does that make sense? So depending on what roads we're talking about and what the context and what purpose that road serves, we may or may not be able to directly reflect what's in your local plan.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rickard. Councilmember Schlink, did you have a question or a comment?
I did. And it's kind of a 2-part, but it's fiscally realistic plan. It's constrained. It's not a wish list. Do you foresee more money coming into other modes of transportation like mass transit?
Yes, is the short answer. So in our...
Sorry, is the pie getting bigger, or is we just making more cuts into the pie?
Both. So, and first, let me talk a little bit about the financial plan for the MTP. So we start off with sort of a trend analysis. How much funding have we received from the state and federal government for the last, let's say, 15 years, right? What does that trend look like? Now, if we extend that out to the, say, year 2045, what does that look like? Okay, well, that's sort of a baseline, bare bones funding forecast. That's sort of business as usual, right? That's how much money we've been getting. And if we continue on that track, here's how much money we expect to have. Now, this is what that transportation investment looks like, or here are the projects we could afford. Now, we've also taken in the Wake Transit funding that's been recently passed in the last couple of years. That funding was not in our last forecast, our last plan. That's new revenue for us. So we've extended that out to 2045. We're not gonna take Wake Transit funding and spend it on I-40, right? So that there are different pots of money, if that makes sense, within that financial plan. Does that help answer the question? Yes. And so then the final decision the executive board made was that it was reasonable between now and, say, 2035 that additional revenue would be generated by some local means, whether that would be additional bonds, which I won't say most, but a good many of our member governments have been issuing transportation bonds over the last couple of years. So those could increase. But the executive board made a decision to include some additional local funding in our funding forecast for the 2045 MTP, which allowed us to fund more secondary roads that we could not normally fund through like the spot system. Does that help?
It does, except that clarifies the roads, but I'm thinking more of light rail. Do you see more money coming to light rail, and is it coming from roads, or is it coming because it's being added?
Well, right now there is no light rail project included in our MTP. There is no light rail in the Wake Transit plan. There is bus rapid transit, and there is commuter rail. But the only light rail project in the region is the Durham-Orange Chapel Hill light rail project that runs from Chapel Hill over to Durham.
The plan is to connect.
Yes, the commuter rail connects from downtown Durham to the Campo region. Yes, sir.
Right, and that's also, I'm just questioning how that's going to get more funding, or would it? And would the funding come from roads, or would it just be added? So where does the money come? When then you kind of hit on it, maybe it's bonds, but I don't see the percent changing. There were some other earlier slides talked about like 3% goes to other.
Well, hold on a second. Let's talk about what's in the plan by 2045, and let me start there. So in the 2045 MTP, you can look at it today. It's online. You can look at the transit map. You can look at the roadway map. There are funded bus rapid transit projects and commuter rail projects throughout the Campo region, and those projects are accounted for cost-wise in our financial plan. Does that help? Yeah. Okay, so if we are, an example of an additional commuter rail project that's not in the 2045 MTP is extending commuter rail from, say, Clayton farther out to Selma, Goldsboro type area. That's way beyond 2045. It's not included in our funding plan, but we do have commuter rail going from downtown Raleigh to Clayton in the 2045 MTP. We also have it going from Raleigh through Cary, through Morrisville, into Durham by 2045. Does that help? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Rickard. Councilmember Wendell, you had a question?
Good evening, Mr. Rickard. Thank you for coming and giving us the education lesson. I know that this is incredibly valuable to me. With respect to the update every 4 years, I mean, that makes sense on the surface. If a municipality was to want to change something earlier than that, is that something that could be then submitted, or is it, do changes have to be made every 4 years?
Short answer is yes. We do a new plan every 4 years, so the next one will be the 2050 MTP. Generally speaking, there is a 2-year update. So one of the things that triggers that is something like the SPOT analysis, which I'm going to get into. But bottom line, the results of SPOT may say that a project that we originally had in a 2035 or 2045 decade, now because of DOT's funding, maybe that should be moved into the 2025 decade. And so we have to amend the plan to reflect those changes, again, so that the TIP and the STIP match. So there is also, again, because we have 24 members, it does not matter when we start an MTP update, someone is going to be right in the midst of a local transportation plan update. It happens. No matter when we do one, somebody is going to be working on their own local transportation plan. And so that 2-year update is a good chance for those folks who didn't have their local plan finalized during the MTP development to have an opportunity to have those local preferences reflected in the MTP.
So that's very good to know. So it really sounds like it's not a static document. It's more of a living plan.
Absolutely. One of the challenges with that is most recently the air quality conformity issue that we've come up with. There's been some federal lawsuits that, long story short, trigger us going back and going through and demonstrating air quality conformity, which can be a 6 to 12-month process. So for me to go in and start an MTP amendment takes about a 45-day public comment period. So I have to advertise, and I have to get that on our agendas and such. And now I have 6 to 12 months of air quality work to do prior to that. So yes, we can update the project, the plan, but a little more work is now involved in doing that. It's not a 2 to 3 month process. It's now a 6 to 12 month process.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Sorry.
Okay, so we'll try to get through the end of the presentation and ask more questions. Thank you, sir.
Stop me anytime if you have a question. So, let me move on. So the purpose of this slide, regardless of what we call the activity, hotspot, corridor study, area study, no matter what the product is called, the intent of all of these studies is to inform the next metropolitan transportation plan. So we have done hotspots in the area, 147, an example. We've done corridor studies in the town, the NC 54 and more study that DOT and AECOM produced. So all of these local and detailed studies, those recommendations get rolled into the next metropolitan transportation plan. Implementing the MTP that is the purpose of the Transportation Improvement Program. It's similar to what you might locally refer to as your capital improvement program. Again, it's fiscally constrained. It must match up with the MTP for the first 10 years. It is the counterpart to DOT's State Transportation Improvement Program. It is also the mechanism by which, if the local governments and the MPO board, executive board do not agree with a particular project, we can pull that project from the tip and stop the project. It does not mean we get everything we want, but it is the check and balance between local governments and state governments in terms of transportation decision making. Now, so we get into strategic prioritization, or SPOT. So let me take just a minute and talk about what life was like developing a STIP and a TIP prior to SPOT. And we lived in a time we had the equity formula, which some of you may have heard. And long story short, that was a way of taking the state funding and divvying it up between different parts of the state, and then DOT and the local MPO would pick which projects we wanted to program and at what time. SPOT came around originally around the 2004, I think 2005 timeframe. It was originally under Governor Perdue, and it was a way to start quantifying scoring projects in terms of volume to capacity and safety and crashes, so we could have sort of an apples-to-apples comparison between highway projects. Eventually, we got into including bike ped and transit and other modes. The 3 steps or 3 actions that an MPO or an RPO takes in this, the first is we select what projects get submitted to this competition. So that's step 1. We pick the projects, our board approves the list, I submit those projects into this scoring competition. The second step is we get to assign points to these projects. And then the third is once all the scores and the results are tallied and DOT develops the draft STIP, our board has to approve the TIP. And that's the final concurrence that we agree with the projects that were selected, what their cost is, what their scope is, and when we're anticipating them being funded. So those are the 3 actions. The prioritization system is broken up into 3 basic tiers or categories. You see in the bottom right, there is the statewide mobility, the regional impact, and the division needs. Now, this next slide, there are 3 things or 3 points I want you to take away from this slide. And the first is how the funding works in the SPOT process. How much money is available at each one of these tiers or categories, statewide, regional, and division. I want you to understand the eligibility, what projects compete within each category. And then the third is the scoring, how these projects are scored and how many points we can assign to each. So let's talk about the statewide mobility pot first. Okay, so that's 40% of all of the funding in the state transportation improvement, for several $1 billion go into the statewide mobility pot. Ben, you've actually got some handouts. Do you mind passing those around the table at this point? So you have the statewide mobility pot, 40% of the funding. Now, the eligibility, what goes into the statewide mobility pot? All interstates in North Carolina, all tolled facilities in North Carolina, the airports in Charlotte, Greensboro, and RDU, and all Class A rail lines. Those are all the projects that get to compete for this very large pot of money. The second pot of money is the regional impact tier. Now you have a map that's being passed around, state of North Carolina, and these little regions are broken up in different shades of blue. A region is a pair of NCDOT divisions. Okay, so if you see Wake County on this map, you'll see it's dark blue. I'm sorry, I don't know if we have any extras for the public, or if I have. Can we get this? Ben, does this work? Okay. Sorry. So my point is, if you look at Wake County, you'll see it in dark blue. It's in Division 5, and it's paired up with Division 6. Right? Now, you also have a sheet of paper here, a rather large sheet of paper. Right? Division 5 and 6 are referred to as Region C. If you see in that first column, the funding, the 10-year funding for Region C is $1.5 billion. If you'll notice, Johnston County is in a lighter shade of turquoise blue in Division 4, and it's paired up with Division 1. So that forms what's referred to as Region A. The 10-year funding for Region A is $592 million, significantly less than Region C. So each region receives funding based on its population. Okay? Any questions? Or I didn't lose anybody yet. Right? So, Region C, we have a very large pot of money, $1.5 billion, but we also have a very large population. Right? So my point is, I take a project in Wake County with its traffic, and I take that and put it over in Clayton, and all of a sudden it is a very big fish in a very small pond. Even though the funding may be really low, the projects in Campo and Wake County compete throughout this Region C. They do not compete with Charlotte. They do not compete with Asheville. They only compete within that Region C group. Make sense? That funding, that $1.5 billion, stays within Region C. So a project like NC 54, State Highway, regional tier, it competes with everything within that Region C. It doesn't matter what they do in Charlotte. It doesn't matter what they do in Wilmington. It very much matters what Durham and Fayetteville submit, as well as the rest of Campo. Does that make sense? Question?
Councilmember Rao?
Again to ask this, but to what extent does economic growth and economic development apply to that? Because if you have a region that, let's say, has 1.5 billion allocated, and a company like Amazon or Apple, for devil's sake, let's say Amazon announced they were going to come here and we're going to have 20,000 jobs. So there's so much more traffic that would come on all the roads, but 54. Would that trigger? Is there any other pot of money out there to meet the demands of good economic growth but unexpected? Like if we got a big windfall like that?
Short answer, yes. There are some economic development and discretionary funds that DOT board members and state DOT has, as well as legislatures, that doesn't pertain to the spot system. But in terms of if Amazon or Apple or Google makes an announcement tomorrow, no, my $1.5 billion doesn't automatically increase. It will be adjusted for the next spot cycle, provided that population is here or
sources of money that through the Commerce Department or
possibly,
other agencies,
yes.
Discretionary funds.
Yes, I do not believe we're talking to the magnitude of $1.5 billion, but there are some other funds out there, smaller pots of money, certainly. So my point in getting all this was sort of lay the groundwork for where your NC 54 corridor competes, what money it's eligible for, but also who it's matched up against in that sense. So that is the regional tier. And then if you look on the bottom half of this large table, you'll see the division category. So that's 30% of the overall funding also. You'll notice there are 14 divisions across North Carolina, and they all start off with the same funding, regardless of population. I will emphasize I did not write this law. Right? So if you look at the population of Division 1 and you would compare that with something like Division 10, you can see that there's the $500 million in Division 1 will go a lot farther than it will across Mecklenburg County and the rest of the Metrolina region. We have that same problem here in the Triangle. Is there a question? Yes, sir.
In this chart where I see Division 5, it says only 86 million. Why compared to all the other divisions? Is there a reason?
Yes, sir. I'm going to get to that chart in just a minute, but right now I wanted to focus on the larger one and the fact that at the start of this exercise, every division starts off with the same amount of money, which is the point I was going to make. The short answer to your question is that $86 million has to do with projects that were already programmed and committed through prior cycles of SPOT, where the costs have gone up, thus reducing the amount of funding available for new projects. Okay.
I had a question, sorry.
Yes, sir.
And you're going to compare NC 54. Does NC 54 also compete against 147 and the airport? Other projects that we could have in town, do those also compete with?
Yes, sir, in a sense. So let me come back to that, because the NC 147 versus NC 54 adds an extra twist, and I don't want to forget that, but I also don't want to. Let me get through one other point. So we've talked about the statewide tiers, the largest pot of money. There are 7 regions across North Carolina that total up to 30% of the funding. Those are based on population, and then the remaining 30% is at the division level, where each of the 14 divisions gets the same amount of money. So that's the funding. The eligibility, again, statewide are basically the interstates, the larger airports, and the Class A rail lines. Regional is all the NC and US routes. Regional transit, which is a strange definition in the law. Regional transit is any transit service that crosses county lines and serves more than 2 municipalities. So that means I can run a bus from Morrisville to Fuquay to Knightdale to Wake Forest back to Morrisville. It's not regional. It's local. But I can run a bus from Garner to Clayton, and it's regional because it crosses county lines and it serves more than 2 municipalities. So the definitions of SPOT and STI, they're in the law. That's what we play by. So that's the regional tier. The division tier are all the secondary roads, all bike ped, all local transit, all the smaller airports across the state. And then most importantly, Commissioner, you notice that you see these arrows going from statewide to region, from region to division. So when we go through the SPOT cycle, DOT will first tally up the statewide scores. They'll program that 40%. Any project in that category that doesn't get funded, doesn't win that funding, gets to go down and now compete for the same funding at the regional level. That's a process we refer to as cascading. So I put an I-40 project in the SPOT. It doesn't score high enough at the statewide level to get funded. It gets to come down and now compete for all the projects in the regional tier, including NC 54. Follow me? Now we program the regional funding. If we don't fund projects there, all of those projects now get to come down and compete for those last dollars at the division level. And so at that point, you have an I-40 competing with a Greenway. Follow me? So you can see there is a preference in this law, in this system, towards the higher order facilities. They get shots at all 3 pots of funding, whereas a 54 at best gets a shot of funding at regional and another shot at the division level. A secondary road only has an opportunity to get funded at that division level. Did I lose anybody yet? Okay. So, and then the last point is how the scoring works. So you'll see on the statewide tier, that score is 100% based on the technical quantitative data that technical quantitative score that DOT collects. We do not assign points to those statewide tier projects. At the regional level, the final score is 70% technical score, 30% local input. That 30% local input is split between the MPO and the division engineer, Mr. Joey Hopkins. So we both put points on division tier projects, regional projects. At the division level, you'll see the score is now 50% technical score, 50% local input, again split between the MPO and the division engineer. All right. Okay. So let's walk through a whole cycle. We put the projects into SPOT, DOT tallies the scores, they program the statewide projects. Anything that doesn't get programmed there comes down to the regional level. Now we put points on the regional projects, they get scored, DOT programs the regional projects, anything that doesn't get scored there falls down, competes for that last pot of division funding. We put points on those projects again, and that's the final results. All right, so it's a multi-step process. It takes about 12 months, 12 to 18 months to get through the whole thing from submitting projects to adopting the STIP. Now, a lot of folks think highest scoring projects automatically get programmed. That is not actually the case, and let me explain that. So there is a number of things that go into developing the State Transportation Improvement Program. It is not simply a matter of taking the highest scoring projects and dropping them into year one of the STIP. Certainly, you can see there on the top, the prioritization, the ranking, the scoring, that takes consideration. Also, the funding category allocations, the different budgets. You cannot fund a project that you cannot afford in these budgets, so that comes into play. The project development timeline, that is a major component. I have a slide that I'll go over that covers that. The STI law provisions. I'm sure some of you have heard things about corridor caps. There are limits to how much we can spend on any given corridor at the statewide level. I-40 currently bumps up against the corridor cap, which prevents us from funding more projects on I-40 in Wake and Durham County. You have light rail caps. You have regional transit caps. There are different provisions within STI that govern whether or not projects can be programmed and how fast. Yes, sir.
Toll road caps?
The only toll road caps that I'm familiar with at the moment is state law restricting the number of tolled facilities in the state. But that is more, I don't really consider that a programming restriction.
And then, I'm sorry, back to the last slide, is toll roads, do they compete at the state level, regional, federal?
Toll facilities are eligible at the statewide mobility level, yes, sir.
At the higher level?
No, the statewide level is the highest pot. So statewide, again, interstates, tolled facilities, the 3 major airports, and all Class A rail. Anything that doesn't get funded there automatically gets to come down and cascade and compete at the regional level. Make sense? Yeah. So you get, okay. All right. So my point about scores and all of these different factors going into programming. This is my hypothetical score sheet, right? So the top scoring project, pick whatever funding pot you want to talk about. The top scoring project scores an 80, right? So it's the highest scoring project. But this particular project is a major freeway on new location, kind of like a 540, right? So you have to study multiple corridors, right? You have a lot of work to do with this project before you can start acquiring right-of-way. So even if it is the highest scoring project, in this example, it can only start getting funding for right-of-way in the year 2022 because you still, like I said, have 3 or 4 years worth of NEPA work, environmental permitting work, public outreach, engineering, design work, as opposed to, let's say, a project that scores a 70 but might be upgrading an at-grade rail crossing to a grade separation. You know where you're going to build it. It doesn't take that long to study it, so it gets to move to construction faster. Make sense? So just because of the nature of the project, some projects are more shovel-ready and can move faster. So in this sense, the fact that one project scored 10 and 80 and was the highest scoring, it still didn't get to funding any faster than the lower scoring project of 70. Right? So the point here I'm trying to make is there comes a point and spot where it doesn't really matter how high you score as long as you make the cut. And the cut in this example would be about a 60. Right? You see that a 60, a 65, a 70. Once you get above 60, it really doesn't matter whether you're a 75 or an 80. These other factors on this previous slide take over, and that's what now controls when you get your funding in the tip. Make sense? That's important because our whole strategy about how we assign points is based on understanding how we go from points to actually programming. So, the point I would make, and I know my board members here have seen these slides 100 times now, but the point is, we have some projects who score so high on the technical side that we really don't need to give them extra points on the local side. It would just be padding their score. In the last example would be taking that 70 and trying to make it into an 80. Again, once you get to a 60, it doesn't really make sense. This is the more common situation we have. We have projects that their technical score is so low, whether or not we give them 100 points, whether or not Mr. Hopkins gives them 100 points, they still can't make the cut, right? The technical score, which either makes up 70% or 50% of their overall score, is simply too low to get them, over the hump into that funding consideration. So in this situation, we usually pass on that project or recommend that we pass on that project. We don't assign points. It doesn't mean we don't like the project. It doesn't mean it's not a good project. It usually means we need to go back and rethink that project and how we can make that project score higher for the next spot cycle. And in this case, this is where your 54 falls in a lot of times. Okay. What we try to do with our points is this. We try to find those projects that are just under that cut line, and we assign those points to those projects so that we can have the maximum number of projects from Campo in consideration for programming and funding. And the little graphic I have here is if the cut line, let's say in this example, is like a 40 or so, we have these projects up in the 60s, and we could give them points and put them up in the 70, but what's the purpose? They're already over the hump. They've already made the cut. It's more strategic for the region if we find these projects down here in the 30 or so, we assign the maximum points here and get them over the line. And the difference is, do we have 10 projects in consideration, or do we have 14 projects in consideration for the region? And Campo is such a big and diverse area that, unlike maybe some smaller areas in the state, we don't have one single magic bullet project. There is not one project in our MTP that is the end-all, be-all of, if we fund this thing, everything's going to be great. We have projects and problems everywhere. And so I may not be able to get the number one project or priority in spot this time. This is what I tell my board. I may not be able to get the number 2, but if I can get number 3 through number 17, that's still a pretty good round of spot, right? And so that's our approach, is we try to get the most that we can and implement as much of our MTP as possible. I hope this is making some sense.
Is that a question on points? When you award the points, that stays with the project forever? They don't
it stays with the project for that round of spot. So, and that's a very good point, and I apologize because I did not mention that. But in a 10-year step, so let me go back a slide or two. If this is a 10-year step, when spot comes out, generally the rule has been for the last 5 cycles that the first time a project receives funding for right-of-way or construction, all right? If you receive right-of-way or construction funding in the first 5 years, so in this example, that's what, 16 through 20? Those projects are what's called committed. They get locked in, they stay on schedule, they don't have to recompete for the next round of spot, okay? The projects that come in for 21 to 2025, those still have to come back and recompete for funding again in the future. So in this example, that high-scoring 80 project with right-of-way in 2022, it has to come back and recompete in spot whatever the next round is for that same funding, where it may get kicked out altogether, depending on its competition. Whereas that lower-scoring 70 comes in year 16, it's locked in, committed, moves forward, it's out of the world of spot and just moving on to the development phase. Does that answer your question? So points don't necessarily stay. Generally speaking, if the MPO board assigned points to a project, generally speaking, they'd probably put points on it again in the future, provided that it would still be over the cut line. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Is 147, I think it got points last time, is that one that's going to have to come back?
Yes. NC 147 is a unique project. And I go back because when I submitted NC 147 in spot 3, I think the MPO submitted that, if not Division 5. It was incorrectly categorized in spot as a division needs project. And when we brought that to DOT's attention, they said they were too far in the process. It should have been scored as a statewide or a regional at the very least. But they put it in at the division needs category, which again is that lowest scoring funding. So we recommended to our board, do not put points on this. Wait till spot 4. They'll fix it. It'll get rescored at the regional level, and we can pay for it out of that larger pot of money, which makes sense. So we put points on it in spot 4, and it got committed. And so it's locked in now in that first 5 years. Now, I say locked in, I mean it doesn't have to recompete for funding in spot. It's still going through the normal project development phase where we look at alternatives. It has to be included in the TIP. It has to be included in the STIP. And if for whatever reason the executive board decides they don't like that project and they want to remove it from the TIP and the MTP, they can. Did that answer the question? Yes. Okay. So, let me move on. So a little reality check as to what we're looking at. These are my slides from the Spot 3 results. And in 2013 or so, when we were working on Spot 3, we were programming the full 10-year window. We had roughly $754 million to program. We had 190 projects in all, Region C competing. Roughly 80 or so were Campo, and we thought 21 or so were competitive. So we had $754 million to spend. The 190 projects that all of Divisions 5 and 6 submitted totaled up to $8.1 billion. So you get a sense of how many losers there are in this competition, right? And what I'm getting at is this red line, this cut line in Spot 3 was estimated to be roughly a 62.5. In Spot 4, we had less money to program because we were only doing about 6 years, because at that point we had projects locked in to the first 4 years. That score threshold went up to like a 73.12. Okay, so it's getting more competitive for less money. And in Spot 5, we now have even fewer dollars, less than $400 million. That number is now up to about a 74.8. So my point is, Region C, that dark blue 5 and 6 section of your map, is one of, if not the most competitive funding category in the entire state of North Carolina. If I took 54 and picked it up and put it in Clayton, it would be funded like that, right? But your competition, competing with US 1 with 64, with everything in Durham, with every 440 and I-40 and all these cascading projects, it is a very tough competition, even though there is such a large pot of money. Does that make sense? Okay. So the division need pot is a little bit worse. Now you have 177 projects competing for about roughly $100 million, and all of those projects total up to about $6 billion. So that's a lot of secondary roads throughout Wake County and the rest of Division 5, all the bike ped, 90% of the local transit, all of that competes for these very few dollars. Now, Commissioner asked, why does this Division 5 pot get so small so fast? One of it is projects that are already committed. The other one, if you'll look on the bottom of this half, about 4 or 5 columns over is what's called DA funding highway. Okay, so that's the direct attributable. Those are the funds that the federal government gives MPOs directly, and we program through our LAP program. So many of you are familiar with the LAP program. You've seen Morrisville submit roadway projects, bike ped projects, and such. That funding gets counted against our Division 5 pot of money. All right? So the DA funding that Campo gets, as well as the DA funding that Durham spends, counts against our division needs pot of money. You go to Division 1, there are no MPOs that have that kind of money, so that full pot, that full 500 and some million gets to go into the spot competition. Make sense? Okay. So, again, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Generally, right now, I sort of wrap things up with, here's where we're at. We've already submitted the projects. The statewide's already been programmed. We've already scored and assigned points at the regional level. We're in the middle of assigning points at the division level right now. So we have roughly $86 million of new projects that can be funded. And that's where these are the latest numbers that DOT released. You can see my bigger table was dated March. Since then, we've had a number of projects who have gone up in cost and scope. And so now we only have roughly $86 million in Division 5 for new projects. So that's where our secondary roads, our bike ped, local transit are now competing right now for that last $86 million. We'll have public comment period is open now and will be through, I believe, October 16th, the day before our October executive board meeting. And at that board meeting, we'll ask the board to approve those final division points.
Councilmember Garamella, you might have a question about the points slide. You could go back to the point slide, please. Right, Alex?
Let's see. Where to? This one?
So the question about the lab funding, right? Like I'm using an example of Morrisville Carpenter that we did a 30%, 70% match. I'm trying to understand between the slide was 70% and 30% data, right? And local. You had one slide there. Yeah.
This slide.
Yes. So if I put 50, like Morrisville Carpenter into this data, so does it go into the regional impact or a division impact there?
So it could be a little complicated, but we submit a project, and wherever the primary benefit of that project is determined, that's the tier that it goes in on. So, for example, if I go to anywhere along I-40 and I decide or submit a new project to convert a grade crossing into an interchange, DOT is going to look at that and say, if we build an interchange here, does it help I-40 or does it help the crossroad? If it helps I-40, we'll let that go in as a statewide mobility project. If it only helps the crossroad, it usually goes in as a division needs project. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if we do something on NC 54, generally speaking, yes, it would be a regional project. There are some situations where we can argue that an improvement somewhere else that benefits an interstate or benefits a statewide highway might be able to score a little bit higher.
Okay. So the reason I was like a little attracted to this slide is we gave 30% lap funding for that. So does that contribute to bumping our local input, or the scoring is, how does it quantify when we increase our lap funding? Does it bump up the prioritization and overall? That was the question I had. And
Okay.
then, you said the money for the lab funding goes against our division. What does that really mean?
So I'll try to make the math very simple. If we start off with $500 million over a 10-year period for Division 5, right? And in that same 10-year period, between Campo and the Durham Chapel Hill Carver MPO, they're expected to receive $100 million of DA funding, right? There is now $400 million to program through SPOT. The $100 million that's DA gets programmed through LAP, right? But we don't get to spend that money twice. They count it against the division pot in SPOT. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, fair or not fair is not the question. So, but that's how it's set up currently.
Was when you see the Division 5, and especially this one where all are allocated the same amount of money, $502 million, is it fair, I don't know to ask this question, but the economic growth of the tax revenue of Division 5 is at a very, very high, and to basically work for quality of life for this division, is it fair to just allocate the same as anyone else in the state?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's more on the amount of revenue that Wake County, Durham, and they generate and the amount of population which is based on those 5. If you look at that particular chart or the chart that you have given us, this one.
So I can hopefully help answer your question with this graphic. So this is an analysis that Campo does every so often. This last version was done in 2016. This is what we refer to as our tax return map. So what this map is showing is the estimated transportation revenue generated by county compared with the actual DOT expenditures by county. So you're seeing what your return is. I'm sure you've all heard North Carolina being referred to as a donor state. So we send up U.S. tax revenue, gas tax revenue to D.C. Federal Highway distributes that, and that's how we end up with roads in Idaho and Wyoming and other places. Wake County is a donor county. So by our analysis, Wake County is receiving something between 50, 75 cents on the dollar for what we submit. And I know a lot of folks say, well, our money's going to Charlotte, and the folks in Charlotte say our money's going to Raleigh, and the reality is neither one of those things is happening. Our funding is going out and building projects all throughout North Carolina. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but if you look at the populations of some of those eastern counties, Hyde, Beaufort, Pamlico, and such, there's a very low population, there's a very low revenue, and some of those bridges and projects out there are very expensive. So it doesn't take long to do 1 or 2 projects to see that rate go extremely high. Make sense? Okay.
Councilmember Rao?
With regard to your statement about 54 competing with other regional projects, I mean, I think it was very helpful to see the slide of just, competing with Durham and all those other cities. My question had to be to the extent that, local municipal government investment in state roads, because I've always wondered, when we found out that NC 54 didn't get funded, we saw the cost was approximately estimated at $70 million. But over the last 7 years, the town of Morrisville has invested probably over $50 million on state roads. When you add McCrimmon Extension, Morrisville Carpenter Road, and even the Morrisville Carpenter Road to the other side with all the pedestrian improvements. So to what extent does that factor into our ability to compete? Maybe other cities have invested that much, but to me, that sounds like a lot of money for a town whose budget is $31 million to invest that much money. So is there a way, I'd be interested, you don't have to answer it now, it may be too hard to answer, but I just am curious as to the out-of-the-box thinking that our council can work with the DOT, but also even Cary and other surrounding jurisdictions so that we can show our citizens that we're doing everything we can to get that really congested part of the road widened.
Yes. So let me be clear, 54 is sort of a unique corridor in terms of SPOT. We have looked at how to take that corridor and the recommendations that came out of the feasibility study, the NC 54 and more study, and we've put those projects into SPOT, and we've revised them, and we've tried new things, and we've tried to submit those projects in creative ways to make them score higher, right? Every round of SPOT, there are slight adjustments to the scoring criteria, right? And most recently, we have taken a hit on NC 54 with what's referred to as safety benefit factors. And that's taken a big chunk of our benefit cost criteria of our score, as well as our safety score. And not just 54, but other urban corridors throughout the state. I am hopeful that that criteria will be adjusted for Spot 6 and that you will see these scores go up. That's not changing anything that Campo does or changing our project, but just the way the projects are scored, I'm hopeful that the scores on 54 and other type corridors will go up.
Does it include first response times?
No, the safety benefit factors that I'm referring to is the technical part of the scoring in SPOT that DOT has developed that says if you widen a road from 2 to 4 lanes, you get this much benefit. If you widen an interstate or convert a highway to freeway, you get this much benefit. Access management gets a different score. Super Street gets a different score. Changing, I think, an at-grade rail crossing to an overpass is the highest score you can get, obviously, because you're eliminating the most potential for some sort of accident there. So different types of projects get different safety scores in SPOT. I am hopeful that a 2 to 4 lane widening will be adjusted going forward so that the median and the improvements that are reflected in the NC 54 and more study will better reflect in the score for Spot 6.
Question, and I promise my last one, is I'm just curious as to, in the past, we had the NC Connect bond, but the General Assembly decided not to tie that specifically to transportation. So if the state put a multi-billion-dollar transportation bond on the ballot in the past, would that money go to the DOT and then go through this system? How would they allocate to generate the additional revenue that we need? Because what I hear from Secretary Trogdon is with more fuel-efficient cars, we know one thing, our revenues are going to decline, and the state's growing.
True.
So, I mean, is that something?
I certainly will not speak for General Trogdon and the Secretary's office. It would be my expectation that any additional revenue, whether it's through a bond or additional revenue from the General Assembly, my expectation is that DOT would take the results from the previous round of SPOT and just keep going farther down the list and funding more projects, or either funding projects that were seeing significant cost increase. Does that answer the question? Yes. Okay. Your previous question about how do the investments that the town has made within the area reflect in SPOT, or do they? So if the town puts funding towards a project, it affects the SPOT score in 2 ways. One, it reduces the cost of DOT, which increases the cost-benefit analysis. And then second, if the project ends up being programmed, the town ends up receiving what's called bonus allocation, or excuse me, the MPO ends up receiving what's called bonus allocation, which is roughly 50 cents on the dollar, which would go towards another project within the immediate area. Does that make sense? So, but if you put money on McCrimmon, that doesn't really help NC 54 score, right?
And one note on that, just as a reminder, the town would have to be putting money on the project while it was within the SPOT database and in that scoring process. So, for example, because we put money on McCrimmon Parkway several years ago, that was before the SPOT process for that. And then, but that did help us get the phase 2 funded through SPOT with DOT through that. But we don't get bonus allocation for it because it was sort of done outside of the SPOT process.
Yeah, a good hypothetical is there's a roadway project out there that costs $100, right? The town's going to put $50 in. DOT scores that project as if it costs $50 because that's the cost to DOT. If and when that project gets programmed, you not only get the $50 from DOT to build the project, but you also get $25, half of what you contributed, to go to another project. Does that help?
Don't follow the logic of so it wouldn't apply to 54 though. So that amount of money, based on the law today that we have, it would not really apply.
Well,
it would apply to McCrimmon.
So the funding would have to be contributed towards the actual NC 54 project, not parallel or neighboring projects.
I wanted to ask, You talked about how the scoring red line has been going up.
Yes, sir.
Will that once again reset and we have a big pot of money because we want to time it so that we're in that first round?
Unless there are major changes to the law. So let me go back to spot 3. The reason why we had 10 years to program at that point was because the General Assembly completely did away with the equity formula, brought in STI, sort of wiped the books clean, if you will, and said, okay, let's start with a brand new, fresh step. I don't see that happening again unless there would be major legislative changes. So we are going to continue to be looking at 5 to 6 years worth of new funding that we're competing for. Does that make sense? So
no new resets.
I would not expect a reset. I would try to get my project to score as high as possible and get in line.
Okay, fair enough. I believe Mayor Pro Tem Mickey Scroggins-Johnson next, and then Councilmember Wendell, please.
Thank you for the presentation. This truly is a very complex process, and there are a lot of moving parts and interdependencies. If you apply money here, this gets raised or lowered based on certain criteria. I actually have 2 questions. Hopefully this is the easier one, and then I'll go to the harder one. Could you explain, and I don't know if I'm asking this right, but you mentioned just earlier about a reimbursement kind of thing. So let's say Morrisville really feels that 54 has to be expanded to 4 lanes in a certain section because it's really causing a lot of traffic jams and so forth like that. When do we spend our money thoughtfully to be eligible for that reimbursement versus if we just go ahead and do it on our own that we disqualify ourselves? Because it is a state road and we really need to have that improvement done.
Absolutely. So let's take, I've got some notes here on the existing projects we have. Let's take Perimeter Park to Weston, right? And I know it's not all the way to Weston because there's been improvements.
That's a really good pick.
Yes. Good example. Hypothetically, if a town needed a $74 million project, right? Right now, at $74 million, that project has a technical score of 33.02. Okay? So if we apply 100 points, and if the division applies 100 points, the full 15 points from local input, that's going to take us up, to a 63, roughly, right? That's probably not going to be high enough, right? What I'd want to do is go back and look at how far do I need to lower that $74 million cost to DOT to where I start seeing that technical score of 33 start jumping up to a 40. Does that make sense? Because if you put in $10 million and that technical score jumps to a 34, you're still not competitive, so it's not going to be effective. Now, when do you actually write the check? That's a different story. So you don't write the check until DOT begins work on the project, but you have a commitment letter to DOT that the town is invested in this project and you, as much as you can, commit your future board legally to those funds in whatever year it gets programmed.
So hypothetically, to raise that score and to invest more in that project to get that balance, if we invested in design or, environmental studies or something to move that towards the completion timeline, would that still be eligible for reimbursement?
I do not believe that any funds spent on the project would be eligible to reimbursement prior to the project being scored and committed in the first 5 years. Now, hypothetically, if a town wanted to go out and spend money on design work for a project, right? And this is a significant hypothetical.
Exactly. I'm just trying to understand
if a town
that grid.
were to go out and invest funds, whether it's in design work, there's a possibility, perhaps slim, that you could narrow the pre-right-of-way time frame for that project. Does that make sense? So instead of that 80 coming in 22, maybe that 80 could come in 19 if we had done all our homework ahead of time.
Right.
Does that make sense?
There's some acceleration potential.
Possibly.
Possibly.
We would certainly want to talk with DOT, the division's office, and some folks at project development at DOT to find out what potential there is, because that certainly wouldn't be true for every project.
Right. I mean, that's the part of my question about disqualification. It's like we don't want to jump in outside the process and,
Even in that situation, you're not getting those funds back from reimbursement.
regardless if it's.
You're just getting the benefit of having your project more shovel-ready.
Yes. Okay, good. The second question is, this is the easy one. Since the SPOT program was introduced, there has been some refinements of the scoring and the criteria and so forth to ensure that there is fairness and so forth. And I really do think that the new approach is a lot more fair. However, I have seen through your presentation and other events that I've attended is that the urban areas seem to always get the most difficult challenges because we get the least leftover money for local projects. So the solution, it's seeming, is that local governments, if they can afford, could help support that gap. But is there any discussion in the NCDOT about revising some of the SPOT criteria so that urban projects are scoring better or getting more funding? Or, it's kind of like there's more need in the urban areas. How do we promote economic development better? So
that is an interesting question, one that is probably debated more than any other topic in the SPOT work group. And for those of you that don't, the SPOT criteria comes out of a work group that includes MPO and RPO, Association of County Commissioner representatives, League of Municipality representatives, Rural Center, Metro mayors, DOT engineers and such, as well as some legislative staff, I believe, that sit on as advisors. And there's a constant argument or debate as to how best to foster economic development across North Carolina. And if we build a road in rural North Carolina, will that help jobs and industry come? If we build a road in RTP, will that help sustain jobs and keep our jobs here? I certainly don't have the answer for that. Having worked in rural North Carolina prior to coming to Campo, I would argue, or I would say there are just as many folks in the rural areas that say they need those projects for economic development also. Or they might have a harder time getting projects funded.
I agree. I see both sides. I see the constituents that say, if you build a road, you will get economic development. And the other constituents that say, we have so much congestion, people are turning away. So you just have to balance, but it's looking at how do we foster.
I would tell you that having been involved in SPOT since the first SPOT 1.0, although not for Campo, this process, despite some of its technical flaws, the fact that we don't get the safety benefits on NC 54 like we think we should, this process of identifying projects is far better than what we had prior, right? So I want to make sure everybody understands that this is a much better system than what we had prior. The SPOT criteria does not always select the absolute best projects or the top priority projects for any MPO, RPO, or division engineer. I would say, though, that the SPOT criteria does a very good job of not selecting projects that don't need to be funded and programmed, which some could argue some of those projects may have been done in North Carolina many, many years ago. Is that a fair?
Yes, perfect. So I'm complete. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Wendell?
Hey, I was almost finished, right? He's like, let's keep going. So And this is probably an easy one. I think I might know the answer, but I just want to hear it, and I want it to be on the record with regard to, we'll stick with 54 for just a second, and then I have a follow-up. So, for reasons unknown, because we weren't here in the past, the road infrastructure in Morrisville, is not gridded very well. And so consequently, our north-south corridors are on basically either side of the town. 54 being a major one. And so we have a lot of decisions before us based on the ability for 54 to lighten some of the congestion that we have. Here's my question. We have Durham, we have Morrisville, we have Chapel Hill, residents of all three cities and municipalities who are impacted by the various sundry bottlenecks, wide openings along 54. If the three towns came together and said, we would like X, does that give any more point value to a roadway being constructed? Because it's not just Morrisville that's getting affected. It may be Morrisville where we need the widening to take place, but it's actually impacting the residents of all three cities. That's my first piece.
It's a good question. Let me try to answer that by saying, first, there's a limit to how many local points can be assigned to any one project. That limit is 100. You can assign 100 points. Now, the spot system does allow MPOs and RPOs to donate points back and forth. So in your situation or in your hypothetical, a corridor like NC 54, if for whatever reason there was a project on NC 54 in the Durham, Chapel Hill, Carburst jurisdiction, and they were only proposing to put, let's say, 50 points on that project, then yes, the Campo Executive Board could vote to donate 50 points to the Durham, Chapel Hill, Carver MPO for that project. Now, they still have to vote to receive or accept those points, but the system does allow sharing of points between MPOs and RPOs. Now, to be more effective, what might be useful is for the jurisdictions along that corridor to get together and decide strategically which improvement needs to happen first in terms of sequencing. And in that case, if we've had some conversations like that on I-40 projects where we're running up to the corridor cap and we only have, let's say, $100 million to spend. We have two projects that score pretty well. Which one should go first? Well, MPOs and division engineers talk, and there's usually some discussion about which should move first. But there is not the sense of if we get letters of support from three town boards, does that help the scoring? No, sir, it really doesn't.
Okay. And then my next, I have just two other pieces, one quickly. Could the different municipalities for the same thing, because say a mile section here in Morrisville impacts, and this might be for the town manager as well, could the different municipalities kick in money for a project within a different municipality to open it up so that it would allow residents in the other two? So could Cary and Durham, say, pitch in some money to go with Morrisville's money to open up a section within our town? If we could, because I think it's a good sell that it would impact in a positive way their residents as well.
I'll speak first and may ask Ben to speak. He may even have some real experience about this, but councils can agree with other councils through MOU processes and interlocal agreements to do any of those types of things. We have a Cary joint meeting where 54 is on every agenda that we ever talk about. So it can be done. I just also offer that's a very simple statement to make and have it occur across multiple municipalities. I don't know if Ben has anything to add to that.
Not really, but Morrisville and other, Cary and Durham or what other municipalities could partner and go to DOT through the spot process like we've talked about and offer to contribute a share of the cost that would increase the score of 54. Yes, that certainly could happen. That would require multiple agreements and could be a little bit difficult, I think, at times to get put together, but that certainly could be something that would happen. And in that case, if if we did that and were successful, we would get, or Campo would get some bonus allocation back and would then get to determine how to split that out between the various municipality areas. But that's certainly something that could be done.
Okay, and then my last piece is in the most perfect scenario that happens based on what you see, and we'll just pretend that we have a perfect scenario. What would be, given the normal timeline without any deals between the municipalities, when would you expect possibly for 54 to be funded to be widened? That's going to be a big determining factor on other decisions that we have to make.
Okay. Well, the first thing I would say in the current criteria and weighting, the cost of the project is probably not as significant in terms of scoring, overall final scoring, as the conversations we're having today would suggest. The safety criteria, that technical criteria, has far more impact on the overall weight. And so that's why the Commissioner asked earlier, if we start throwing money into the project, how much money do we have to contribute before we see a significant increase in score? I'd want to do some research on that for you before we started talking to Carrie and Durham about drafting MOUs and funding agreements, because it might be more than any of the partners would be willing to bite off. In a perfect world for funding, I'll go back to the project development timeline. For the NC 54 widenings, we've done some pretty good work with the NC 54 and more study. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb that we've seen is project scores well in spot. If it's successful, it lands somewhere in year 6 through 10. It comes back and recompetes in the next round of spot, and provided that it stays above that cut line, DOT will keep it on track and move it forward. Does that make sense? So you put a project like NC 54, and this hypothetical, because this isn't the right time frame, we're looking at a 2029 step now. But in this example on the screen, if we put a 54 and more project in, regardless of score, 80 or 60, right, I would expect that to land somewhere in the second 5 years, simply because of all the other projects, regardless of score, that are already ahead of it in the current tip. Make sense? So you come in year 6 through 10 of the current step, you go through spot 6, or in this case spot 7, right? You get rescored, provided this criteria doesn't change, provided your score doesn't drop, that project stays on schedule, and what was year 6 is now year 4. Does that make sense? And in terms of how do you know what I mean when I say year 1, 2, 3, and 4? So in this example, year 1 is 2016, year 10 is 2025. So every 2 years you're updating your tip window changes by 2 years.
So then, using reality, if we were there kind of now, I mean, the soonest that we could possibly even be moving forward and breaking ground would be sometime after 2025, right? And probably closer to 2030 or 30.
Probably closer to 2030. If I'm doing Ben, help me out here. So I'm looking at a 2029 step. The projects do not score well enough to be programmed now, so we jump 2 years into the future, and we're looking at a 2022 to 2031 step. First 5 years, 22. You probably come in year 2027, 28, 29 in spot 6, and provided you stay on schedule and score well again in spot 7, yeah, you're coming in somewhere between 2026 and 2029. 2026, yeah. For the first year of right-of-way.
To dig.
For first year of right-of-way.
For first year. Yeah, so then we're looking at another.
And that's for the west end and to perimeter.
That would be I would say that would be consistent for
projects.
the Maynard to Cary Parkway section, or the west end to Perimeter Park section.
Okay, so gray hair's coming.
Now, that's not unique to 54. I'd say that for NC 50, Benson Road south of Garner, and a lot of other roads too. It's not specific to NC 54. It's just the timeline and the amount of funding that's available and when.
Thank you,
So
sir.
it's sort of a generic answer.
Is that satisfactory? Well, not great, but it's an answer. Councilmember Johnson, then Councilmember Schlink, then Councilmember Garamella, please.
So Alex mentioned before that we've tried to get 54 scored, and it has scored low. So we're going to keep trying, as he said, and hopefully work on the safety aspect of it. And not that I'm thrilled that it scored poorly to date, but we have a whole lot of projects that are in the works right now. And to Alex's point before, the old formula and the old process was very unfair to the town of Morrisville. With this new process, as fair or unfair as it is, and we can argue that point, and I'd argue a lot of things everybody said, we have still been able to garner $250+ million worth of road projects on practically every other road. It seems like 54 is the really last project we need to get complete here. So even if we didn't get it until 2027, the rest of these projects are going to be in the works until 2027. So we can't. The other thing we talk about a lot is the fact that we need all these projects, but we don't need them all at the same time to cause gridlock here in the town of Morrisville. So, I don't know if this is, good or bad that 54 hasn't been funded to date. Would I have preferred that it be funded first before all the others? Well, yes, but it didn't work that way. So I think we keep working on this and we'll get there. And so that leads to my next question. Are we going to talk about 54 specifically?
We can.
Because I'd like to talk about, because we've asked the questions in the past about should we break up the rest of 54 or not? And so maybe if we can talk about that a little bit, about
Sure.
how actually we're going to get this done and funded and moving forward.
Sure, and the screenshots I have up here are taken directly from the NC 54 and more feasibility study that DOT and AECOM completed a few years ago. But from 540 or for the northern town limits to Perimeter Parkway, that project is already gone through SPOT, was scored, was funded, committed, and is moving forward. So it's not built yet. We don't have to worry about that project or that section in terms of SPOT anymore. The airport rail grade separation, we submitted that project to SPOT this round. It was the first time that project was introduced, scored rather well, a cost of $20.3 million at the moment. Technical score is around a 35, which is not bad. It needs to be a little bit higher for this round. I would suspect that we want to look at what other type of improvements could be made in the area, whether we're looking at airport south of Church Street that might influence the travel time savings and the traffic that would be picked up on this project and therefore alter the score. So the reason why I'm talking about a grade crossing for a widening project like 54, any of these structures, whether they're rail or over water features or interchanges or grade separations, that's the bulk of your project cost. So any of those pieces that we can get split out and put on another project, that's going to reduce that $70 million overall corridor widening. Make sense? Which is why when you look at the SPOT list, not only do we have a $70 million widening from Perimeter Park back to Weston, but we also have the airport project, we also have the aviation project. All of those costs are included in that $70 million widening. Make sense? So long story short, we're trying to skin the cat as many different ways as we can to get this corridor to score well. So those are the projects right now. There's the widening from Weston to Perimeter Park. There's the grade separation at airport. There is upgrade at grade intersection to interchange or grade separation. That's the official project type at aviation. That's probably the highest scoring of these projects. It's still not over the cut line, if you will, but it's very close. I would expect, again, with some of those safety benefit project changes, hopefully in Spot 6, we'd see this whole corridor score well. But that's one that if we can make some improvements at that intersection, whether it's at grade, whether it's grade separation, whatever the final design ends up being from that project, that's cost that gets removed from the general 2 to 4 lane widening. So that's why in general, you want to try to take as many bites out of big costly projects as you can, get the overall score down, get the overall cost down, which makes the score go up. Does that help? So we have those 3 projects in the Morrisville area, and then we have another widening, which is from Cary Parkway back to Maynard. That project scores slightly higher than the widening. One of the things, and I know this simply because I've been in communication with the Cary staff, is the recent development along that corridor and the right-of-way that's been dedicated somewhat reduces the cost of that project, therefore slightly increasing the score. It's my understanding you have a little bit of a challenge in that respect because a good chunk of your corridor is not really primed for development because of the environmental features in that area, and so that might be a little bit of a challenge for us there. So, but those are the current projects we have right now. I don't want to jump too far ahead and say, well, let's start thinking about how we might revise these projects, because we don't want to really make that decision until we see the new rule book, what the Spot 6 criteria is going to be. It may be that we leave these projects exactly alone and they score higher because of the changes to the criteria. Depending on what those changes are, we may look at revising these projects to make them score better. So I would expect to know more probably this coming spring. We'll start looking at submitting new projects for Spot 6 this summer.
Councilmember Schlenk, please.
And it led where I was going. Could you put up the slide going back to McCrimmon's, please?
Sure.
Because I think and thank you for coming and spending the time with us, and it's very enlightening. And I think for my colleagues and for the audience, if you go back and look at what's occurred from Wake Tech, from the toll road all the way along 54, I think this is a good example of what starts to happen when we start to make investment. And the ones with the airport over, the airport one, there we go. So I would just put in my plug to say that I think airport is something we could do doable to connect airport to and would help the whole town, from Town Hall Drive to Church Street on airport, and then airport back to Davis Drive, that small section with Twin Lakes. And that would help the score here, I believe, for this overpass. And this is something that could be done doable. I think that why you would still have openings at McCrimmon's and Morrisville Carpenter wouldn't disrupt whole town traffic. And then my understanding is Cary has plans to take airport all the way back to 55, not dead-ended at Lewis Stevens where it currently is now. So that's where, again, I would like to leverage our money right there at that grade separation and helping get points there. And then I think according to your presentation, that would help the whole corridor along 54.
If we could, let's see, the at-grade crossing there, when you build that structure over 54 and over the railroad tracks, I guess the key issue there would be what additional improvements are you making along 54 for that to happen, and how much of that cost gets removed from your $70 million widening. But that's going to be the real benefit there to 54 in terms of spot score, is having a little bit more right-of-way and probably a little bit of the construction there at that structure taken care of through another project.
Just as McCrimmon's, the bypass wasn't envisioned until we put money into the bypass, the grade separation at McCrimmon's.
Yeah, so right now, if you wanted to look at something like that for Spot 6, you would want, the Spot project involves structure over 54, over the railroad tracks, and tying into Church Street. Doesn't include any improvements south of Church in the Spot project. That's a $20.3 million project. Scores roughly 35. Let's say if you wanted to contribute, I'm going to make up numbers because I don't know, $5 million, right? You probably help that technical score a little bit. Again, I'd want to work with your staff to try to figure out exactly how much of a bump you'd get on the technical score. And then again, if it got programmed, half of that $5 million would come back in a second project later on through bonus allocation.
Okay, then a couple quick questions about the current 54. The little bump out there to the right, Michigan left, we call it, I guess?
Yes, sir.
Are those really necessary, and would they help lower the cost? And then the same thing down at the other end of town about having to take out the apartment complex, a building of the apartment complex. What if we just didn't do that? Wouldn't that save a lot of money?
So let me try to answer the U-turn question first. So I don't want to comment too much on what the final recommendations were or second guess what Morrisville, Campo, and Cary endorsed back in, I think, 2013 when we did this study. But I do know there was a considerable work that went through this. That super street element is very safe. It's very common. DOT is implementing that in a number of corridors across the region. One that comes to mind right now is NC 55 around Holly Springs, where it is not the most, how should I say, I think the general response is, do you like that design? No, I don't. Does it work? Oh yeah, it's absolutely great. It's much faster than it used to be, but it's inconvenient if it does restrict some movements. Everyone at DOT will tell you it is far safer design because of the number of conflict points that it eliminates from a traditional four-way intersection. So it is far safer. I can tell you in spot, that design is going to score higher than a general four-lane cross-section with a median and no other access control. So that's a higher scoring design from spot's perspective. As to whether or not we take out the acquire and
Can you just point to what you're talking about, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I think the question refers to these bulb outs, these U-turns here. And the super street element, or synchronized street as it's sometimes referred to, with a median, it restricts left-hand turns. So instead of having to look left and see two lanes of oncoming traffic come out, cross the center turn lane, and then see emerging into the right lane of fast-moving traffic, which is where you end up with your T-bone type crashes and your higher fatality rates. The design says you come out from your parcel, whether it's a business or a residence, you're restricted to make a right turn only. You go down a few hundred feet, you merge over to the left lane, and then you make a U-turn, which at that point you're only having to look at two lanes of oncoming traffic. So it's a safer, if not somewhat more complex, not more complex, but more, yes, thank you, maneuver. But it is safer in that you have fewer conflict points at every given point. Does that help, or did I answer the question? So,
I just noticed Cary doesn't do that in their section of 54, and then they have a section of 54 that goes through their downtown. I don't think they're planning to do it that way either.
That is true. But I would want to make sure we're not comparing Chapel Hill going through Cary, where it's no longer 54, with the volumes that you have on 54 through this portion of the corridor. Once we get past Maynard, the traffic volumes change pretty significantly, right? Because more folks are now hitting 54 and going around at that point. So that's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison.
Well, Crimmins might do that for us too, the extension.
Okay. So that's right in here. Yeah. I'm trying to make sure my answers are not completely specific to NC 54, but to the spot system as a whole. DOT is going to review every project that we submit to make sure that it's reasonable and that it can be constructed. And so they're going to look at the 54 corridor and they're going to say, if we build something here, we're going to have to get out of that right-of-way, the railroad corridor. And so they're going to look at that. And then they're going to try to use not necessarily a worst-case scenario, but a realistic scenario in terms of coming up with the cost of that project. Does that make sense? So then, once that project gets funded, even at that cost, we come back and we now go through the regular alternatives analysis process, which may or may not involve acquisition of different right-of-way. But DOT is going to probably insist that we score this project with that cost in mind because it's a likely consideration.
You're basically saying it doesn't have to be that way, but they have to look at it that way.
In general, yes. Trying to think of another good example. Perhaps, do we have any design work that shows us with a 4-lane median divided facility out of the railroad right-of-way that doesn't include taking that building?
I think there was earlier plans where they split the road. Before all this, there was a 1990s plan that showed you would split. There was a pair going in and out of aviation, and I think it was discussed. It was looked at.
I think Mr. Howell has some input on that.
Yeah, that was, I'm not sure that was ever endorsed or even really looked at very closely by NCDOT. That was a proposal in our 2007 Town Center Plan. And I think it was also, may have been discussed a little bit during the 2009 Transportation Plan development, but I don't know that DOT ever really looked at that. Alex is trying to stay more general, but for NC 54 and specifically with this study, with 54 more feasibility study, NCDOT did go in looking at more traditional widening of NC 54. And in this area, with traditional widening, their other big major thing was it had to be outside of the railroad right-of-way. And so that's why we ended up with having it go and take those, look like they would probably take those apartment buildings. I think if the town wanted to consider some other designs for widening 54 in that area, and maybe such as going back to the idea of, maybe a one-way pair or something like that, that's certainly something we could do. We could work with NCDOT and Campo to look at potentially another feasibility study. We could fund a feasibility study on our own, but that would potentially push any potential funding of 54 widening probably back a little bit further, because DOT would at that point want to get the feasibility study completed before they put any new design into spot. Is that correct, Alex?
That would be a fair statement. That I think the best thing for that corridor is to try to get it funded in its current design and cost, and then let the regular project development timeline look at different alternatives at that point.
Thank you.
Councilmember Garamella.
I have a couple of different kind of questions. Back in when they started 540, they had an exit from Kitts Creek, going into 540, and then it was stopped, and they opened up a different 55 and 54. When I go back and look over a period of last 15 years, that intersection, I have not gotten a single correct answer as to why it was blocked, going into 50, Kitts Creek, from Kitts Creek Road into 540, because that was a perfect merger into 540 and take a lot of traffic off this area corridor. Do you have any insight on that?
I'm going to keep the streak alive. You're not going to get the answer because I don't know.
Mr.
That was
Howell?
before my time at Campo.
Councilmember Garamella, I think Mr. Howell might have some insight.
Okay.
Now, that was also before my time here, but I think you're really talking about the Davis Drive. Davis Drive initially had an interchange with 540. I don't know this for certain, but My best guess is that the reason it was closed is, and I've heard this anecdotally from NCDOT folks, it had to do with interchange spacing. DOT has fairly specific interchange spacing rules for freeways. When I was working in Chatham County, we actually were working on a US 64 study, and we ran into this with the new interchange that a developer wanted to build on the 64 bypass around Pittsburgh. And so depending on how they classify a specific freeway, they have interchange spacing anywhere from, it has to be 2 miles apart, they have to be 1 mile apart. So because of how they brought 147 in to tie in with 540 and the interchange that needed, that then I think precluded keeping the interchange open at Davis Drive.
Can I add a little bit of that too? When that all happened, it was advertised up front as a temporary interchange. It was always temporary to Davis Drive, but people got used to it. We all liked it. I used it myself, 540 to Davis Drive, and then I think it was almost 2 years before the 147 came, and by then people had forgotten that it was this temporary access point. But it was always advertised as being temporary, and I knew that would be a problem.
Then the question is now using our tax dollars more efficiently, making a ramp all the way from 540 to 147 to connect to either Davis or Town Hall is a lot of money compared to what it was, you can say, temporary. And yeah, not much choice, yeah. And the other part of the question is, why the rest of 540, there is no toll, and on 54, there's no toll, but from 55 exit, the toll starts. So with all these areas which are going on, I get a call from a lot of constituents. They say, is it possible before we relieve all these, clogs and all the funding models, can the toll be taken one exit behind 54 so that the people really can get on 540 immaterial of, it's like the whole concept of interconnect and roadway system is to flush a lot of the heavy traffic into the highways and the interstates. But by creating this concept of toll only from that particular exit, even there was a talk if the rest of the 540 would be a toll when they were repaving it, and then they made a decision, no, they're not going to do that. So I had a question about, why one exit is causing so much of havoc around this whole area, if you have any answers on that.
So make sure that the question is about the specific location of the toll gantries along the corridor. Okay, so just to be clear, the 55 to 401 section and the 401 section to I-40, as well as I-40 back to I-87 and near Knightdale, all of that is expected to be tolled facility, right? So I want to make sure that I didn't hear the southern portion of 540 was not expected to be tolled.
I think Councilmember Garamella is saying if you had the toll before exit 69, so people had to pay to enter off 54, they'd be less likely to drive through our town. They'd actually get on earlier as to not have to do that to avoid the toll.
I would have to refer you to the Turnpike Authority, Mr. Bo Memory or Andy Leluski over at their office, and I can try to get you their information and have that conversation.
Because that's one of the things, because I had written down, is MPO not part of the toll, or because initially you said that the 40% funding, it's all part of the same organization, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure as to what thinking or information was provided as to where those facilities were located along the corridor. I don't know, and I wouldn't want to tell you the wrong information.
All right, fine. I think if you can get the information, I'll be able to follow up. Then the other question is, I'm looking at all the railway corridor. It's $70 million for our intersection. I don't know the cost of from Cary Parkway to Maynard. And this is just hypothetical thinking. How much hard is it to move the railroad 50 feet to the other side than going to this hundreds of millions of dollars that we are thinking of just trying to accommodate because of the railroad.
Can I just add that that's the biggest outside the box we've heard tonight?
My understanding is that is a significant cost, and I'm sure we've all heard stories about difficulty working with railroad entities. So with that, I can just tell you I can go back and suggest that alternative be looked at. I don't remember specifically, Ben, what we looked at for 54 more in terms of adjustments to the rail corridor, but I remember the conversations being about structures at aviation simply because of the height and how far back you have to go along a rail corridor to adjust for a few feet.
The only reason I say it's like, because if you look at the south of all the corridor, it's all undeveloped area, and I don't know the terrain, I'm just throwing as an engineer's mind. The other side is already developed heavily, so might be. Because I think what is Adams' property, they have a railroad that goes into their thing, and that was built a long time ago.
Mr. Howell?
One thing to keep in mind with the railroad is that they actually own their corridor in fee simple ownership. Unlike other railroad corridors in the state that are easements in some cases, this is actually a fee simple. They own the land. So the likelihood of them wanting to move their corridor at all is really, really, really low. In addition to that, as far as, we've had, I think as part of the 54 more study, we had some very initial brief discussions with the railroad about, keeping 54 in its current location and just widening away from the railroad. And their stance was that by their future plans, they need all 200 feet of that railroad corridor. Over the years, they've done different plans. At a minimum right now, we know that they're looking at least 2 tracks through the corridor. They have looked at potential in the past for up to, I think, 3 freight tracks and another 2 commuter rail and or light rail tracks when the one point light rail was a possibility in this area. So in order to do that, they need all 200 feet. Even in order to get a second track, they would need, they need a lot of the land. And then certainly for commuter rail, which in some places will probably take three tracks in this area, because of separation requirements, they're keeping that 200 feet as much as possible is actually going to help us on the commuter rail transit side because of separation requirements between tracks, and especially if we're going to be putting in commuter rail stops with platforms and everything, that takes additional space. So I think in this case, it actually is probably easier to move the road than it is to move the railroad.
Okay, Councilmember Rao, and then I'll make an attempt to wrap us up on this subject.
I just wanted to clarify if there's any good news that came out of tonight. For me, it's just to clarify that there could be a possibility of breaking up smaller projects to reduce the scope of 54. So there's something that we'll have to work on, but as we go out there and talk to citizens, that could be a potential avenue of accelerating that project.
It is something that we would try to look at for any project in Campo where every information we have says this is a much needed project, and yet that need is not reflected in the score.
Okay.
We would do that for any project within Campo. I want to be clear that we can't go into a corridor and just chop up a project however we like. So DOT, for example, DOT is not going to let us build half a bridge, right? So whatever we submit has to have its own independent utility and function. And so if we need to widen a section from 2 to 4 lanes, at minimum, the endpoints of that project would have to make sense to DOT for construction purposes.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, well, I think there's a lot that has to be fleshed out, but just knowing that could be something we could look at so that eventually we could look at allocating, smaller increments of money or financing for specific identified projects. I just wanted to clarify that before I left tonight and for those listening. As a follow-up, I just have one question about, and maybe this is a question for staff as well, but I know that about a year ago, or maybe sometime, I remember us writing a letter to Campo asking that the toll extension be restricted to Davis Drive, and then there's been talk about, but still that decision hasn't yet been determined. So I just want to know where we are in that process. What is the timeline for the toll extension, and has that letter been taken with all seriousness by the governing body and by Campo from our council?
Yeah, just want to be clear. We're talking about the NC 147 extension.
47,
project.
yeah.
Yes. So the original project that was submitted and scored in spot was NC 147 extension to McCrimmon. That was originally what was shown in the 2040 MTP. That was originally what came out of the 2013 hotspot that Campo and VHB did, simply because the other alternative that went to Davis Drive went through some property that was a prime site for RTP, and they were not excited about losing that property in right-of-way, and the corridor to McCrimmon was already dedicated right-of-way. Since then, the MTP shows the alignment going to Davis. That was the letter that the previous mayor, I believe, delivered to the Campo Executive Board requesting that change in December, I believe, of 2017 when we were going through the MTP. That alignment has been changed in the local plan. The NC 147 project goes to Davis Drive in our long-range transportation plan. In the funded DOT project, there are currently sort of 4 alternatives moving forward for study. The first, as I was mentioning earlier, for every project is simply the no build. That's the baseline that we compare back to. Option, what I would call 1A, is going from NC 147 to Davis. So again, I'll just refer to that as 1A. 1B is that same alignment, NC 147 to Davis, but with a side connection down to McCrimmon, which may be like a right-in, right-out only, 2-lane connector to help facilitate local traffic. And then option 3 is that original alignment that goes from NC 147 straight to McCrimmon. So those are the 3 alternatives that are being studied. DOT is going through the normal process of looking at environmental and human impacts, cost, going through all of that scoping requirement. Then they'll come back with the results of that analysis, and that'll be the next step in the process. I do not know the timeline on that, but that will be another note that I will follow up with you all tomorrow.
That would be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And Mr. Ricker, just to follow up on that one, your option, I think it was 2 there, the original to McCrimmon, in a recent meeting we had with Campo here at town, you indicated that that's probably unlikely because of a 3 left turn lanes being necessary to get onto Davis after that, or?
I don't want to quote the numbers because I didn't commit the hotspot to memory. But if memory serves me correct, the vast majority of analysis showed that the connection to Davis had far less impacts local transportation-wise. It was a much desirable alternative from an engineering perspective. And I want to say it was triple, if not quad lefts that would be required from McCrimmon onto Davis with that connection, which is getting pretty close to interchange level turning movements.
So not a sure thing, but we shouldn't be that concerned about that when going forward, probably.
Again, all of our analysis shows that the Davis connection outperforms the McCrimmon.
Mr. Howell.
And just to follow up on Councilmember Rao's question about the rough project schedule, I had reached out to NCDOT a few weeks ago and had gotten a very rough schedule. At this point, they are expecting that the initial functional design alternatives and the public meeting in which those will be unveiled and discussed would occur sometime during next summer. And then following that point, they will begin narrowing down to a preferred alternative. And then right now, the initial phase to get through all the way through to that preferred alternative is expected to take approximately 18 months.
Okay, so I'll try to wrap this up because we've been at it for about 2 hours. So it sounds like we need to sort of keep trying within the system, as Mr. Rickard has proposed, keeping it and seeing if we can get it into the present projects, but also work outside the box, maybe try to get some of those under funding alternatives that were mentioned by Mr. Rao, maybe economic development, and some other way to get some other funding. We'd also, maybe we can ask staff to work with Campo actively to aggregate the projects to improve the scores along the corridor, like he mentioned, to sort of get a better idea about their airport extension, the overfly there, whether or not it would make sense for us to try to do a project on our own, going towards the tracks on airport, even though that wouldn't really go anywhere, but it might improve the project score going forward, or is that something that would be part of their project and wouldn't make sense for us to build a road to nowhere just to make a better score? And maybe see if there's any way to correlate any of that to our current transportation plan update and make sure that these notations and ways forward on 54 at least are part of our plan so that they're documented into the future. Does that sound reasonable to everybody? Any other thoughts, Mayor Pro Tem?
I just want to clarify before we close this session that it's not a road to nowhere. We would be thinking about connecting Church Street to the airport stub that is at Twin Lakes. So that would increase connectivity and ultimately could increase the score for the flyover.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Appreciate it. Okay, so we thank you, Mr. Rickard, for taking the time to come out here and get us up to speed, especially to talk about 54, which we know is a pain point for us, so we really appreciate that. I'm going to ask if we can go ahead and take a 10-minute break and then come back for our next work session, the next part, 7B. Is there any other staff comments at this time before we go to break? Okay, it's 8:26. We'll come back at 8:37. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's 8:37. We're going to come back into session right now. We're going to go to item 2B of discussion items, infrastructure payment in lieu, private development frontage improvements on state roads with funded improvement projects. Ben Howell, Long Range Planning Manager. It's my understanding he needs about 5 or 10 minutes to get through his presentation, and then he'll let us know when it's time to accept some questions, and then we're going to have some discussion at that point. Thank you. Mr. Howell.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening. So this is, parts of this presentation are similar to what you saw back in January, February at the retreat, if you can remember that far back. So some of this may look a little familiar, but we did want to bring it back and get with a little bit more clear, some more clear asks from the council so that we can get some clear direction for staff to move forward. So just a quick overview of the presentation. Again, just provide a quick overview of committed transportation projects. We'll talk about our existing requirements for new development, and then from there we'll get into sort of our 2 decision points, or our 2 points where staff is asking for direction from council. One is dealing with public versus private development, and then some options for consideration for payment in lieu or performance guarantees for those type of developments, and then we'll finish up with some next steps once we get some direction. So first up is committed transportation projects in Morrisville. So just as a reminder, we have several projects, road projects funded over the next 7 years between the town and NCDOT. They're listed there on the screen. They should be at this point pretty familiar to all of us. As we mentioned during the last presentation, it is close to about $240 million worth of road projects alone. So we do have a lot of investment coming. As you can see, it's a lot of our major roads, and these roads are also where we have a lot of development pressures as well. So currently for requirements for new development in our transportation plan and unified development ordinance, Our transportation plan calls for widening of most of the roads in town, especially those major thoroughfares, a lot of which are funded for widening from NCDOT. And all of the roads are recommended to have curb and gutter and either sidewalks or multi-use paths. And then some roads in our 2009 plan are recommended for bike lanes. Some of that is changing, may be changing depending on the outcome of the draft comprehensive transportation plan update that we're going through right now. But we wanted to base this presentation on our currently adopted plan. So that's what this information is based on. In our Unified Development Ordinance, we do have requirements we require developments to provide frontage improvements that match the transportation plan recommendations, including sidewalks, widening of the road, bike lanes, adding curb and gutter in certain circumstances. And then we also have intersection improvements that are based on a transportation impact analysis. Most of the time what we see with that coming out of the transportation impact analysis is going to be traffic signals, additional turn lanes or new turn lanes, or restriping of the road to better move traffic through those intersections. And then the other requirement that new development has that's not a town requirement necessarily, but from DOT and especially on these DOT roads is driveway permits. So NCDOT grants those driveway permits on any state maintained roads, and as part of that driveway permit process, they may require turn lane construction, and in that case they really look at safety, and they have some relatively hard and fast rules on when turn lanes are required depending on what the road looks like, what the speed of the road is. They have some, I think they call them nomographs that'll tell them, if the road is 45 miles per hour, then you need a 100-foot long turn lane if you're expected to have a traffic generation of 100 trips per hour. So that type of information. They will, NCDOT may waive turn lane requirements in certain circumstances. Generally, they waive those due to cost or constructability factors, but they generally do not waive turn lane requirements for developments on roadways with committed transportation projects. Their stance on that is generally, yes, the transportation project may be committed in the STIP, but until the construction begins, we're not counting on it. And in addition, if the development is complete before the transportation project comes through, they want to make sure that development's access is safe. So the first point for discussion with the council is dealing with public and private development. So currently, quick definition, public development would be any development funded by a public agency such as the schools, Wake Tech, Wake County Library. Currently, the UDO does not differentiate between public and private development. So staff wanted to put forth these two options for council to discuss and give us direction on in dealing with public and private development with this issue of transportation improvements, especially on these corridors where there are committed transportation projects. Option one that you see on the screen here is essentially doing the same thing that we've been doing now, which is treating public and private development the same. It's what we do now. All developments treated equally. It secures funding for the improvements if NCDOT removes project funding or something changes with NCDOT project. A con for this that we've seen happen is that it does increase costs for public development. And so that is something that we certainly wanted to point out to council. And then the second option would be, of course, to treat them a little bit differently. What staff is recommending for this option would be public development would be required to install safety improvements such as turn lanes, but they would not be required to provide security for transportation infrastructure such as more the general widening to meet the frontage improvements. But they would be required to install those safety improvements and provide security for the transportation infrastructure. Pros to that is that they may reduce costs for public development, and it does give clear direction for that public development. But of course, the con is you're now treating publicly funded development a little bit differently than private, And then road frontage improvements may not be built if for some reason the NCDOT project is not constructed. And with that, I'll pause here for any council questions, or if you want to have any brief discussion. This is sort of the first direction point that staff is asking for. So,
Councilmember Schlenk.
Currently, which one do we use?
Currently, we do option one, which is we don't differentiate. So development's development. Any development, whether it's publicly funded or privately funded, has to do the same things, has to provide the frontage improvements, has to provide any safety improvements, has to provide any improvements recommended in a transportation impact analysis.
And so could you give me an example of something coming forward or something we've done, then how it would change?
So if council were to want to go along with option two, one example of where that may be a little bit different would be, for example, Wake Tech. They came in with another phase, say their phase that was up on Paramount Parkway, that accessed off Paramount Parkway, and we had a plan at that point that recommended an additional travel lane for Paramount Parkway. That's a bad example, I'm sorry. So looking at state roads, so Wake Tech's doing something on another section of NC 54. And our plan says you need to widen 54, you need to put in a median. But that same section 54 is funded for improvement by NCDOT. It's a committed project. In this case, they would only be required to really install turn lanes that would be needed for a driveway permit to get cars safely in and out of their site, but they wouldn't have to install those frontage improvements. We would wait and have NCDOT install those frontage improvements.
But then a private developer, he would have to do all that.
Yes.
So are you afraid of a lawsuit?
That's something that we would certainly have to look into as we begin crafting the any text amendment language, based on the direction given by council. This is, again, tonight we're asking for direction, then we would need to bring back some UDO amendments, and Courtney may have some thoughts too.
Just one more question on that same line. What other towns do it option two around us?
I'm not aware that any towns around us do anything like this. So.
Option one.
Yes, for the most part. As far as I'm aware, and what I've found is that most towns around us generally treat public and private development the same.
And the reason why we're bringing this forward is kind of twofold. One, it's a follow-up to retreat, but two, there is a specific request of staff. So the specific example is, both Public Works is being impacted as well as the current recycling facility in Wake County is being impacted. So both entities, are currently evaluating, how do you build a new facility while keeping your existing facility. At the same time, there's public road improvements coming in. So it was specifically requested of Wake County, do you have any special exceptions or anything along those lines? Current answer is no, because we would hate to have to pay for something that somebody else has already funded, in theory, through the state. So that's really kind of the genesis of part of this question as well.
Councilmember Johnson, then Councilmember Garamella, please.
So if I'm missing this is that part of the ask here, that this is only available to public development when there's a funded project?
Yes.
Okay, so in this case, aviation is a funded project, so that would fall into this new option.
Yes.
If aviation was not a funded project, then what would happen?
Then they would have to do
all the work.
Yeah, they would have to do the frontage improvements, any TI improvements, plus the safety improvements. They have to do everything. So this is really narrowing in on those areas or those roadways where we have funded publicly funded transportation improvements, and we're really looking at if it's a publicly funded development, do they get a break because the public's already going to be funding transportation improvements potentially a year or two down the road?
Okay, and so then, so if it's a committed and funded project, tell me why it would not, why the funding would be removed? Why NCDOT might remove the project funding? Why do you have that? I know you're trying to cover all bases, but how likely is that going to happen?
It is pretty unlikely, but NCDOT does have some caps written into their rules that they operate under, where if a project cost goes above a certain percentage of the approved cost in the STIP, it may have to go back into reprioritization. And in that case, it then could get rescored. Or if the project scope changes so much that it doesn't really match what was originally funded in the STIP, then they may say, we're going to take a step back and reprioritize this project. So that's what that's trying to get to. For our projects, I don't necessarily see that happening, but it can happen.
Could somehow kind of tighten the wording so that we're kind of covered, because I don't mind, because if it's a funded project that's going to happen anyhow, well, okay, sure, but let's tighten up that wording so that we're not caught somehow in the, and I don't know how you do that, but.
Yeah.
Councilmember Garamella, then Mayor Pro Tem Scroggins Johnson, please.
Actually, I was going straight to that public works. I think that's where the corridor I could see. What if the aviation widening was pushed by 5 years, which is very common in these dates that you're throwing? It's 8 years from now. It's 5 more years it has been pushed. And how does that work? Because are you saying on a 2-lane road, all the improvements will be done, expecting sometime DOT will pick up aviation and do it?
Under option 2, if we were to amend our ordinances to allow option 2 and that were to happen in that case, then there would be no widening along the frontage of that site until NCDOT came in and did the project.
So for me, it's more of, is it not double? It's kind of double taxation, because this is like a tax money, and again, for our widening itself, we have to, put a bond to do it. But at the same time, how are we transparent to private and the public? Is it, you're fine, we'll wait for you, because we just went through this whole corridor of Morrisville Carpenter, right-of-way acquisitions and all kinds of things. And the PIL that we have committed and taken. So is that fair? Or more of a frank question here, how does that fit into the people here?
Yeah. Well,
I'm not sure I have the answers.
Yeah.
Don't have answers.
Mayor Pro Tem might have a comment on that one.
I think this is about effective use of funds and also sequencing. So we could use public funds in the case of these public facilities to build these improvements, but yet DOT would have that part of their project scope. So you'd actually have an overlap, and which goes first depends on prioritization and a lot of other factors. But if NCDOT has it within their scope and it's a funded project, the improvements for that public project should be such that maybe they build the sidewalks and do some improvements that'll make that facility usable, but some of the other major widening would be done later because it wasn't critical to that project, but it would be in the scope of the NCDOT, therefore using public funds one time versus using it twice and then deconstructing to reconstruct the project. I see this as a very narrow scenario and not as broad as I first thought. I was listening, actively listening, going, wow, does this just mean public is this and private means that? But it doesn't. It's only in the case of a road improvement that has been funded by NCDOT as it corresponds to a public developed project and those relevant road improvements. But my comment is, shouldn't we request that they do sidewalks and so forth, because that improvement then has to be kept for the NCDOT project, because that's about some of those additional amenities?
In most cases, yes. If a sidewalk is existing, DOT would then replace it. You can get into timing issues about when DOT goes out there and does their survey and determines that the sidewalk's existing or not. For example, if they start their engineering work now and they go out there and say, oh, no sidewalks here, so this would be part of the betterment split that we've talked about before, and then a year later a development comes in and builds the sidewalk, DOT's going to say, well, that wasn't there when we initially did our design, so we're not going to include it, include rebuilding it if need be. Now, if it can, our goal with a lot of development even today is always to try and get that sidewalk in the final location, but on some of these corridors, that's going to be very difficult to do. Aviation Parkway is one of them because there's a lot of issues with that road. The other thing to think about too is with this first direction point, and if it'll help, we can move on to the second one, is that this one is really focusing on having whether public development should, whether it's build or pay for public funded road improvements that'll be coming down the road. And whether that, they should be allowed to do something a little bit different than private development. Our next decision point that we have gets into, okay, now regardless whether what we decide here for development that we are still saying you have to do road improvements, our next decision point will be, build them, provide payment in lieu, we provide some sort of refund mechanism, which we'll get into as we move on through the presentation. So if council thinks that'll be helpful, we can certainly move on to that and then come back to this decision point. But that's another thing to remember as well.
Okay, I think we had a couple more questions on this one, so if we could just finish those up. I think I still see a lot of things up. I know Councilmember Wendell's next. Does Councilmember Johnson want to go again? Okay, so Councilmember Wendell, then Councilmember Garamella. Then we'll try to wrap up this decision point, and then we'll try to get to the second one. Thank you, sir.
Hey, Ben. So everything is about risk and what is risk potential, right? So when we're looking at this option, I understand it completely. How many public developments within Morrisville are potential, are on the horizon line that would potentially be impacted? Is it just one or two, or do we have 24 potentially public developments going to take place in the horizon?
Certainly cannot say for certain. I mean, right now we know there's the Wake County Convenience Center and the town's public works facility. Those two are moving forward with the feasibility study and looking at designs. Other than that, and we know Wake Tech will continue to build out. They did significant improvements along 54, so I'm not sure if any of their other phases would really require improvements on 54, but they will have future phases that will require improvements on Watkins Road. Again, that's not a committed road at this time, but certainly could be in the future. And then we can't, there could be any number of other type of developments in the future that, I can't say at this point. But I mean, the ones that we know are coming are the Public Works Facility and the Convenience Center. And of course, we know Wake Tech will continue to build out.
And then just one quick follow-up. If we were to adopt this at some point in the future, we collectively said, I don't think this is going to work for us in the long term. How quickly could we switch back to option one?
It would be a matter of a text amendment. Courtney, do you have thoughts on that?
Depends on the complexity of the amendment that's written in the first place and how long it takes. General rule is text amendments are in front of the Planning and Zoning Board in 1 month, Town Council 2 months. So we always say as a rule of thumb, that's a 3-month process. We can typically squeeze it down to a month and a half. But if you have lots of public comment, that schedule, no longer applies. Depending on complexity, whether or not it's a consultant. I mean, best case scenario, we can write it and have it ready to go in a few weeks. Assuming capacity and a lot of other factors. Worst case scenario, it could be a few months. I mean, there's just a lot of factors that go in play. But as a general rule, it's just one tiny section, and it doesn't start impacting lots of other sections of the code. About a 4-month process max.
And can you clarify, did this go to Planning and Zoning Board this time, or are you asking for a text amendment now?
We're asking for guidance now, since we've received requests and it was a follow-up item. And based off your guidance, it will then may or may not require changes that would require a text amendment. And once those are drafted, it would go through the public notification, Planning and Zoning Board, Town Council process.
Councilmember Garamella?
Ben, I think partly answered my question is there a possibility that we could take PIL and all the kind of stuff that is needed as any private developer and hold that till it is not done within a certain time frame? If it is not, then use it to build it, because technically it has to be some kind of a security to the town and also to the public, who is to be transparent. Because for me, ethically, I see do it now and change the text amendment. That's not ethically correct. That's my opinion. But we have to be fair to everyone, and I do understand it's how much money are we trying to save here, and since it's a funded project, if it's like $2 million, can we work out with DOT saying that, hey, we will do your improvement of this part, and this is the price that we are, already front-loading it. Will you pay us back or something? Because that's more transparent for me than just changing text amendment and going back and changing it again. That's just not ethical to me.
Yeah, and that's getting into the sort of the second decision point. This one really was looking at exempting public development from a lot of those frontage improvements. That's really what it comes down to, is exempt public development from having to do those frontage improvements, the wider improvements we generally require, or not. And then we get into the second decision point, which is for whether it's public and private or just private at that point, how we deal with any development on these committed improvement corridors. So with that, do you want me to move through to the next part of the presentation?
Yeah, I think to give us a little bit more context, that might help us make this first decision. Thank you.
So next up is looking at some options for transportation security. For transportation infrastructure security. So first off, talking a little bit about payment in lieu and our current UDO requirements for payment in lieu. Development is either required to construct the frontage improvements or request payment in lieu of construction. We generally require the construction if it's feasible. And then depending on the development, whether it has to come to council or not, either council or staff will decide if the PIL will, if the applicant requests to do PIL in lieu of construction, either staff or council can decide whether that will be accepted. In our ordinance, we do require 150% of the engineer's cost estimate of construction for the PIL. And then, of course, we do have in our ordinance the option where town council can waive PIL for town projects. So looking just specifically at PIL, option one would be for these corridors where they're committed transportation improvement projects, requiring PIL in lieu of construction. And we would just outright require PIL. some of the pros there you see on the list, we can then use that money to fund the betterments on the NCDOT road projects such as sidewalks or even bike lanes if needed. It would ideally would avoid multiple periods of construction in one location, gives developers clear direction. They can add it into their pro rata and into their figuring for their financial for their projects. It also secures funding for the improvement if for some reason something changes with NCDOT funding. And of course, safety improvements as well as any TIA recommended improvements would still be constructed. Cons, which we hear now, is 150% is a lot, and then of course, even with accepting PIL, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the road frontage improvements will be built if NCDOT removes that project funding. What we've run into a lot is, as we've seen construction costs continue to increase, and even at 150%, that PIL does not always cover the true construction costs, even though we've gotten a lot better about getting exact on that PIL, but at the same time, we can't control the market, of course. Option 2 that we've provided here would be requiring 2 payment in lieu for improvements, one for roadway and then a separate one for bike ped improvements. And in this case, after the construction of the improvements were to begin, then we could refund that roadway PIL, but then we would use the bike ped PIL to help us fund the betterments for the DOT project. And again, pros and cons are very similar. One con of this one is that it would require some additional tracking by staff, but certainly we could do it. Pro from the developer side, they would receive a refund for their roadway improvements PIL. Again, they would still be required to do any safety improvements and TIA improvements. And then the third option...
Mr. Howell, if you could wait a second, I think Councilmember Rao had a question on that slide.
Okay.
So in option 2, I know Mayor Cawley in the past has been really passionate about doing what we can to be more proactive about bike safety and bikers. And so that would actually give us more flexibility to do that. Option 2, correct? Are we not doing that in the option 1 payment in lieu?
Option 1 and option 2 would potentially give us that. Option one, we're just saying it's a payment in lieu. You pay it to us, and we use it how we see fit. For that roadway corridor. Generally, we're going to be using that to help offset our betterment costs for DOT for these projects. In option 2, we're refunding any of the roadway improvements, but we're still getting that bike ped money to help offset our betterment costs. So from the standpoint of it helps the town fund bike ped improvements as part of NCDOT projects, option 1 and 2 are the same.
Understanding what is the difference of what's being asked here, when cons, but the difference was the bike ped improvements and the requirements for the 2 PILs, but you're saying that we can do that in option 1 as well.
Yeah.
It's just okay. Going back to the first one, when we look at and maybe I'll let you finish because I had a question about the first one. So go ahead and finish.
Okay. And then our final option 3 that we've provided is to only require PIL for bike ped improvements that we could then use towards our betterment costs. But we would not require a payment in lieu or construction of roadway improvements, with the caveat that safety improvements and any improvements recommended by a TIA would still be required. Again, this would allow the town to build up a fund for betterments on NCDOT road projects, gives the developers clear direction. But again, the major con being if for some reason something changes with that NCDOT project, whether it's funding or construction scope or whatnot, those frontage improvements potentially may not be done because the town wouldn't necessarily have a payment in lieu for those frontage improvements at that time. So that's the last PIL option.
And these last 3 you're telling us about, these are all just for the private side?
It would be, that's dependent on the council direction on the previous decision point, the public versus private development. If you want to continue our practice essentially of treating public and private development the same, then any of these options, these PIL options, or any of the performance guarantee options that are next in the presentation would apply to any development, whether it's public or private.
Okay, and you had a slide earlier that said that one of the things that we can do is we can waive PIL for town projects. Would an option be to expand that to public projects?
That's something we could certainly look at as part of a text amendment. We would obviously want to work with our town attorney.
All the options, right? That would say, well, we can waive it for ourselves, or we could waive it for public and leave private the way it is.
Courtney, do you have any thoughts on that?
We can explore any options, but we will need to, speak to the town attorney to make sure that what we're doing, is, complies with any regulations and case law that's out there. Okay. And that's part of the purpose of this. I mean, there's kind of two ways. Do you treat the same? Do you treat differently? And that's kind of question one. And if you're going to treat differently, how do you do it? So that's really what this is boiling down to.
Because, it says right there that we can waive our own and that we're already treating ourselves differently. And that hasn't been a problem as of yet?
No, and the reason we do treat ourselves differently, we would basically be guaranteeing that we're doing our project. So we would be setting aside money guaranteeing that we're doing our project. And in theory, why would you put a bond out? Are you going to call a bond against yourself? And so, that's some of the logic that goes behind it. Now, that's for town. Have we waived bonding requirements for public projects? Wake Tech, yes. Library, we waived. And the reason being, they've allocated X funds for the project, so the X funds are available. So the risk is dramatically lower than with a private entity where you don't know for a fact how much bonding was involved in that public project to be built in the first place. So there's a much higher risk associated with, the highest risk by far, I would say, is private. Then your next layer is, in theory, other public agencies. Generally they all do the right thing. And then you get down to kind of the last tier. We're kind of the lowest risk. We set the money aside. If we fail to meet our regulations, then it's on us at that point, if we've done that. And we have to answer to, the taxpayers at that point.
Yeah, that's what it seems to me like. The taxpayers, either of Wake County or from Wake Tech, they're kind of us as well. So that's why I sort of lump us with them a little bit. But this is a little bit different in that if we forgive them a road improvement and NCDOT doesn't do it, then it just doesn't get done. And if we forgive ourselves, it's on us anyway. So it would be up to us to pony up. But so this would be lost opportunity to have it done at all. So I guess that's one of the things I'm considering. Looks like Councilmember Garamilla has a comment or a question.
More for Courtney and Benjamin is, when is the timeline of all this going to play in? Because we have to go through this whole programming of public works, and we see 2025 for aviation extension. So are the dates going to align, or is it going from the discussion that we are having? I can easily say this is going before the other one, but are we into a discussion from 1 year from now would be different if they have started design work of aviation and also your public works, and then talk about it. Then this is kind of too early in the process, I feel.
Well, there is initial design of aviation. So, and that was then used, some of those initials, for both kind of where's our starting point when we start designing public works? Where's the starting point, the edge of the right of way when we start, when the county starts designing. So, that basic information. However, I'm not comfortable speaking for the timeline of the public works, and I'm certainly not comfortable speaking for the timeline of another facility. I think in the ideal world, you would have a new facility in place before your other facility's torn down. I mean, that's just so that way you can continue operations. So I think that's kind of the ideal, but I can't really speak to either one. And again, to me, when this gets down to, just where I sit often, I think equity needs to occur. I mean, I think what's good for the goose is good for a gander, as a general rule when it comes to regulations. However, I also think there's an issue when you start double taxing, in theory. I'm paying my Wake County taxes through a bond, in theory. I'm a Morrisville resident, I'm paying for a particular road improvement this way, or I've paid through my gas tax. So there's that. So I think that's where you have to look at, is there a reimbursement method that you can particularly, because I think we need to think full picture, are we willing to take on a road improvement if something happens? And the money's taken away, that we've continued to allow development to occur, public or otherwise, and we're not making sure the minimum standards are met, and we're creating more capacity issues on our road. So, for me, it's how do you, get their portion of the betterments, which is always their responsibility, the sidewalk, the street lighting. How do you get that, and how do you have them participate in that? And then the other is how do you secure it? So if something does happen, that the town has the ability to go back and put those improvements in so that it's not a loss the town's having 100% potentially fund.
To that end, I'd sort of lean towards the PIL, that we could forgive the public if we wanted to, but that we maybe collect it and have the option to reimburse in the future if it's not used, because it sounds like for NCDOT betterments, if we want to take their 5-foot sidewalk and make it an 8 or 10-foot greenway, we have to pay for that difference. So it'd be good to sort of accept that in advance if possible. I'm not sure. Any other council members have comments? Councilmember Rao?
Or of any option that enables the town to receive as much security as possible to do exactly what my concern is. So in other words, to me, the treating them the same would actually be more money for us to do improvements to make the 5-foot sidewalk, 8-foot sidewalk, because if we don't get that, then we are lowering the cost for public projects. I'm just trying, so I don't know what that option is. I need guidance from you in this case, because I'm in favor of whatever puts us in a better position to collect as much cash as possible to put in improvements that we need for the town. We heard today from the DOT, we're doing everything we can, but we're always going to be behind the 8 ball. So that's just where I stand. Now, if we can do that with option 2, which is treating them differently, what I'm asking staff is, what are we getting? Are we going to be able to maximize that ability to collect it for whatever we want to do if we do it with option 1 versus option 2? Which is going to give us more cash in hand to do projects?
And I'd say, so it's not just PIL cash, there's also bonding. There's other mechanisms out there. We could require, instead of waiving bonds, we could require them to put a bond in place. And if that bond is in place and there's some default, we'd have to look into that a little bit more. But if I'm hearing Councilmember Rouse, at least his position, it's how do we develop a partnership that at the same time doesn't increase the liability of the town in the long run for making sure that improvements, are not on the town's tax dollars, if you will. So making sure the improvement occurs, but what's the best, developing some best method, if you will, to make sure that the person building is paying for the betterments, and then we're just securing, the town's interest in making sure that ultimately something happens long-term with, NCDOT, that we have the ability to go back and put those improvements in place.
Tech, just one follow-up. So like when we say public, Wake Tech's already been constructed and they're going to be doing expansions and adding new buildings. So would this actually apply to expansions, building additional buildings, or is it like a public facility that hasn't been built yet, like the Wake Convenience Center?
There were specific rezoning conditions tied to Wake Tech, which really set some of the time frames and the improvements based off the master TIA they built. Now, if they start to dramatically depart and say they want to make something much more intense, I know currently the the number of students there has exceeded forecast. If they find that's the continued trend, do they start building more and more and more over the future? If so, does that go back and start, impacting, what needs to be done on 54? The reality is 54 in front of Wake Tech is going to be rebuilt. There's a road improvement project that's funded for that. So it could impact them, but I can't tell you that it will. But, what if a school found another site in Morrisville? What if a park is built here? I mean, you can go down, a list of lines of some public, amenities. What if Cary wanted to build something over here and purchase land for some reason? That's another, it's not just Wake County. You have other public entities that could come into play.
Councilmember Garamella, and then we'll try to wrap up and give some direction.
Yeah, I think, how about, like the person from campus said, when you do a project and, what's the right way to, like the money allocated could be repurposed somewhere in the town, right? I'm just using hypothetically, we collected PIL, say 1.5 million for this extension, and we know it's going to be done. We would commit that amount to be used so that we are transparent to the people. At the same time, we are repurposing at a different location, as like the payment in lieu for Parks and Recs does. Like we can use it anywhere in the town jurisdiction.
So first, my apology for slightly cutting you off there. To answer your question, no, you can't. If we collect it for the purpose of road improvements on Davis Drive, then it must be used on road improvements for Davis Drive. Parkland payment in lieu is a little bit different, simply because we are such a small jurisdiction. However, if you're the county and you collect it in the southeast corner, it kind of goes in the southeast corner. So it's a little bit different just because of the size of our jurisdiction.
Councilmember Schlenk, please.
Thanks, staff, for your hard work. But I guess if we're working off the premise that is there a problem that we need to fix? So I'm kind of back to, I think the best way to handle the first, which seems to be the problem, is just do it like we've done it in the past, or we could provide a waiver for the first problem, I guess, the driveway, not payment in lieu, but we talked about just offering a waiver, which I think we've done in the past. To me, I don't think we need to separate the two, other than I would tighten up the waiver process and give future councils an idea of what you're looking at, why a future council would consider this and maybe waive it. And I think those can change and use that in other things. And then the payment in lieu, again, I don't see if there's a problem that we're trying to fix, especially if we're not distinguishing between private and public. So I'm thinking you might be overthinking this from the UDO standpoint. But I understand, especially if there's nothing in front of us that affects this. And then I don't need comment. I'm just thinking about it. But the other thing is I don't think towns have a good track record, and ours maybe, for collecting this money and then using it eventually. I think what ends up doing is maybe like the Hindu Society. We hang on to it for 20 years and then it becomes a problem. Or with other things, I don't know if it's legal to collect it and get into that aspect of it. So that's all. Those are just my initial thoughts.
And I think you have some really valid points. The only part that I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page was the first statement or comment about bonding. So currently, and I'm just going to use Wake Tech as an example. Wake Tech had to put everything in. We waived the bonding for that everything in case they failed to do it. So what makes this waiver a little bit different is it's not that we're making them install it so D&T can come pull it out and put something back in that particular bond. This is about not installing it, just making sure your turn lanes are in and collecting either a bond or a PIL for the difference. And I just wanted to make sure, because I don't think we apparently explained that very clearly, that the processes are a little bit different. And I just wanted to clarify that.
Mayor Pro Tem Scroggins Johnson.
Mayor, looking at this now from an overall picture, I think that I'm in favor of like the option 2 of treating public and private slightly different so that we can lower barriers for some of our public projects as long as we're legally sound and not making improper policy. I think Wake Tech is an excellent example of sequencing, and there's projects that are active as well as our public works. We need to give ourselves a little more wiggle room. If we can refine the language to talk about the situation, a funded NCDOT project, blah, 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 that will help us get very good clarity and also allow the applicants, whether it's the town or the county or another public agency, to really understand when this does apply and when it doesn't apply.
Okay. So,
Mayor.
yes.
Sorry, I have like a couple more slides.
I apologize. I thought we were done.
That's
with
okay.
slides.
If I can get through those real quick, because the other option we did want to throw out, in addition to payment in lieu, would be using performance guarantees, which we've already talked about a little bit tonight. Currently, our UDO only requires performance guarantees for public improvements that the developer's already going to have to do. So they have to do they're already going to be building public improvements. They have to provide us a performance guarantee limited by statute in our ordinance to 125%. And they get that performance guarantee back once they've performed, once they have completed their roadway construction. That's where Courtney was saying with Wake Tech, we waived that requirement because we knew they had the funding already in place, and they would have had to go get more funding in order to provide the performance guarantees. So one of the a couple options that staff wanted to put forward is, instead of using PIL, using these performance guarantees such as a bond, a cash deposit letter of credit for the roadway improvements. So option 1 with the performance guarantees would be to require a performance guarantee instead of payment in lieu for road improvements, where that guarantee would be released once improvements are constructed. And again, we would still require the PIL, the payment in lieu, for the betterments that would not be refunded. Similar pros and cons to the PIL to the PIL case, other than a couple of different cons. One, performance guarantees are statutorily limited to 125%. Another con is that surety bonds and letters of credit can expire. And then those, of course, because they can expire, that requires a little bit of additional tracking by staff to ensure that they remain in effect. And then if for some reason we have to call those, that could be a little bit difficult sometimes for us to call those performance guarantees. Option 2 would be to require the performance guarantee only for safety improvements not required by the NCDOT driveway permits. So we would not require them for frontage improvements. And again, we release performance guarantee once those safety improvements are constructed, but we would still be requiring the PIL for the betterments. Again, similar pros to previous options. Cons, again, limit the statutory limit on the percentage, and other than that, I mean, really the same cons as the other performance guarantee option. So finally, staff did want to provide some recommendations to council. And so so staff recommendation is for public and private development to treat those two types of development a little bit differently. Only require the public development to construct their safety improvements, but do not require a security for transportation infrastructure. Meanwhile, private development would be required to construct safety improvements and provide the transportation and provide the security for the transportation infrastructure. And then on the other question, staff would recommend the PIL option 2, where we have the two separate PILs. Roadway, we refund the roadway PIL once that construction is underway, but we keep the bicycle and pedestrian PIL to help us fund the betterments. And we would, of course, as part of that, work out a tracking mechanism for issuing those refunds. And then just once we get the direction on those, we would work on preparing UDO amendments based on that direction and bring those UDO amendments back through you. As Courtney mentioned, they would go through Planning Zoning Board, Town Council, public hearing process with notice to the public.
Could you bring back the staff recommendation slide, please? Because that seems like a low-hanging fruit to see if we have support to just move forward with that. I would also ask that we could possibly have our legal team look at whether or not we can add waiving PIL for public like we do for the town in general. Although this seems to cover that right now because it would not require security for transportation infrastructure, which would be the PIL. Is that correct? Correct. Am I interpreting that correctly? So that's not really necessary in this case. I'm going to see if we have consensus for this, but I'm happy to hear some comments first if anyone wants to comment before asking for head nods on this, just going forward with the staff recommendation. Seeing none, I'd ask if we have consensus head nods to go forward with the staff recommendation as our direction on this issue. Okay, could you please speak into the thing and tell me what your question is, sir?
I want more Frank to weigh into all these things because I see both sides of the coin.
I think that'll be part of the process. Is that correct?
Yes.
So this is the beginning of the start of a process. So I hope, is that the direction you guys need to go forward? Just a second, Councilmember Schlink has a comment.
Just for clarification, what's the difference from what we do now for transportation, infrastructure, security, and option 2? What's the big difference?
So the big difference is, one, we would rewrite our ordinance where in the location, if it's on a roadway with a committed transportation improvement project, we would just go directly to requiring a PIL. We wouldn't let them construct the roadway frontage improvements. We would only accept the PIL, and then we would require 2 PILs instead of the 1 today. 1 PIL would be just for the roadway improvements, and then the second, that would be refunded once that project is underway, and then the second PIL would be for bicycle and pedestrian improvements that the town would keep and use to help fund our betterment costs with NCDOT.
Can you share an example of a case that has happened where it didn't occur? You didn't get the road improved, or?
So, I mean, right now we actually have a number of cases from over the years where the town has accepted PIL and we have not yet used that PIL for an improvement project because it's a lot of times it's a proportional PIL for transportation improvement projects. But we've also been successful in using PILs lately. We've been able to use them for the Slater Airport Boulevard traffic signal. That was how we provided a lot of our cost share on that. So did that answer your question? Or?
Well, I don't see the difference then from what we're doing now. That's all I'm trying to say.
So the difference from what we're doing now is that it'd be two PILs instead of 1, and PIL would be the default. Right now, the default for when development comes in, no matter where they're located, the default is you need to construct these roadway improvements. And then if the road project is coming fairly soon, then we will work with them and say, well, PIL may make sense in this case. Okay. And then the other big change is 2 PILs instead of 1, with one of those PILs being refunded back to the developer.
So in essence, we're kind of doing option 2 already.
Not quite, but close.
Okay.
Yeah, because option 2 now, it gives us some betterment PIL that we get to keep no matter what, and as long as that's legal, that sounds nice. Yeah,
and right now, when we accept PIL, we keep it. I mean, we have not, other than I think the Hindu Society was one where, there was that question, but for the most part, we have not refunded PIL. Our goal when we accept PIL is to use it on a transportation project.
But these are different because we have committed projects and we expect NCDOT to actually do that improvement on everyone's behalf. Councilmember Schlink again?
One more quick question. Just then tighten up the language for refunding the PIL for road improvements after construction begins. Does that mean 4 years later after construction begins, they get refunded?
That's something we would look at with the text amendment language is, putting if we need to put time limits on that and figuring out the best way to do that. So.
Also, I'd be concerned about whether or not we have to pay that 6% interest as well, if we could make sure that that doesn't have to happen.
We would certainly look into that.
Councilmember Johnson, please.
So just to clarify, that this option, the second one is to avoid incorrect road improvements that are then torn out and redone correctly down the road.
Yes.
And how often does that happen? Has that happened quite a bit?
It depends. We haven't seen it happen a whole lot yet, but we know of several circumstances now in areas where it will happen, where we've had road improvements done that we know with the improvement projects that are coming down the pike that there's going to be some redoing of the work.
That's like wasting money then.
And then in addition to that, you also have the multiple periods of construction where you have private developer coming in, doing all this road work, and then potentially a year later NCDOT comes in. Even if they don't have to redo the private development road work, they're still coming back in and doing all the road work again and getting back into traffic control and everything.
In doing this, would we forego our right to say, no, go ahead and build it anyway, though? Are we locking ourselves into having to accept PIL in these circumstances?
Yes, that was the idea behind the option 2, is that we would lock into, and only on the roads where there's the committed roadway projects. And of course, we would want to, in our ordinance, we would make sure to keep that pretty tight. But we would be locking it into, if you're building on a road that already has a funded roadway project that is committed, then you would not have the option to construct. You would only have the option to pay the PIL.
Why would we want to give up our legislative authority to say do this or do that?
Again, it's more of a, for this type of thing, it's probably more anything a little bit of a convenience for, partially for the developer, but also for our public, because you're limiting the number of, construction zones or construction periods in front of a development. We're still getting the guarantee for the construction. We're just not requiring the construction at the time. So there are certainly, as I presented, there are some cons to it, but there's also some pros.
Okay, just because I'll Councilmember Wendell, just after this one point. It seems like when we don't have the case where there's a funded, committed project, this council has demonstrated concern that if we don't get it done now, it's going to cost more than 150% when it eventually gets done. So I just wanted to remind us of that.
Right. And in that case, again, this would only be for those areas where there's the committed roadway project. So if it was a development on Davis Drive, our initial thing would be you need to build it unless you can prove to us that you really can't. For some reason, or the DOT is not going to let you. We have run into certain circumstances where DOT doesn't really want that improvement on the ground yet either. So, but again, this would only be for those circumstances where they're on one of those few roads where it is a committed project in the state.
Okay, Councilmember Wendell?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's. I think you said it already, but it was comparing apples to oranges. If it was oranges to oranges, it probably wouldn't be fair to pick and choose PIL or build it. But because we're talking apples and oranges, either a funded project or not funded project, then it makes that point moot, I think.
So I assume we're all still good with giving that consensus with the staff recommendation after those comments. Is that correct? Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Howell. That was very complicated, and thank you, staff, for making it a lot easier for us to get to a decision where we can give you some policy direction.
All right. Thank you.
I believe Town Manager Page, I believe, has an announcement or two.
Just one. I wanted to give council an update on the cricket tournament, which I will say was supposed to start tomorrow. And by that, you should get, it is not going to start tomorrow. The teams are in town, but there was a meeting this morning to just check field conditions, look at best options, and so a decision to delay the start till Thursday was made by ICC this morning. And what they're de facto doing is just already using up one of their rain/rest days. So there will not be a start to the tournament tomorrow. It will start Thursday and go Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, a day off, and then Tuesday and Wednesday. And that day off could again get pulled back in if there would be some rain events. Second part of the official change is the matches were supposed to start at 10 and the second match at 3. They requested a delay in the start of the matches to continue to allow the field to dry out in the morning, and then the second match just follows the third match. So all of that was worked out. A little challenging conversation this morning that I just want you to be aware of, because what they actually decided they wanted to do was move the matches to afternoon and evening matches, which would have put that evening match starting in rush hour. Beyond that, all of our logistical and operational planning, including police and fire and rental of parking facilities and shuttle buses, was set on the schedule that we had prepared. And we did not feel we could operationally support that kind of change with little to no notice. We made those concerns aware. We were very appreciative that they understood those concerns. We want this to be our showcase event and did not want to compromise all of our operational plans for that kind of change. We did discuss night matches over the weekend. They did not want to do that because they could not provide equitable opportunities to play under the lights to everyone, but it is something that with more planning we feel like we could support. So we just did want you to know it was a good collaborative decision. We are keeping track of all of our input and cost to the event so that we'll know that, I mean, this is our pilot, this is our showcase. So we're excited. That information has gone out. It's updated on our website. There's been some social media posting. We've been waiting to get the flyer from them, which they have not sent. I think they may have also made a switch in a matchup, but that's, of course, on their side. So the pitch wasn't in great shape on Monday, but it did sun up and dry up very well today. We're hoping that the other fields that they'd like to practice on, which are Shiloh and Cedar Fork, will dry up a little bit further. That'll allow them to do their practice. But so lots of great effort by staff. One of the other things that you should know is we collaborated and have offered our town employees opportunities to volunteer during the week as a part of their work schedule. So many of our employees will be out there as volunteers, and TCL has a lot of forces that they'll be using over the weekend. So you may see, I don't know, town manager driving a bus, I don't know. There's a plan for shuttling most people in. So Chief Andrews is in lead on that and has worked with the staff. So limited parking in Church Street parking lot. I have a parking pass for you. And I have been in communication with Wake County, really just waiting for this decision to make so that they can also come and see what some of their money helped support as we get this event. As you may recall, having these events is very important to fulfilling the requirements of the grant money we got for the lights. So there are opportunities for those of you that might want to be there. They award a man of the match after every game. It's a round robin. So If you plan to be there, and you just have to wait till the match is over, I can't tell you what time to be there, let me or Jerry know. They are more than willing to have you involved in making those types of presentations if you know you're going to be out there. So just let us know and we can help you coordinate if you want to attend. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to hand out your parking passes. You do have passes into the Church Street Park, but it will be restricted. People will not be able to get in without a parking pass. And we've coordinated several parking lots. All of this information's on our website, but really good logistical plan that we just did not feel we could change at this point in the game.
Thank you very much. That's a great update. Councilmember Wendell, then Councilmember Schlink, please.
Just a quick question, Town Manager Page. Are there going to be concessions on the field, food trucks or any concessions? And then the second piece is, I have not seen any news stories or anything. Has the local news media been involved, or are we doing any kind of news media coverage? Because it is kind of a cool thing for our town.
There will be food trucks. I can't tell you which ones or how many, but there will be food trucks. There have been those plans made for the event. We have provided, again, social media posts, press releases, et cetera. I can't offer to you what TCL or ICC has done. Irrespective, I do believe this will gather some press. Jerry's also working with the Greater Raleigh Sports Commission, and they will, I'm sure, be advertising the event as well.
Councilmember Schlink?
Just to follow up, and I think you got it covered, thank you. But I know we've invited some dignitaries from Wake County and then the sister city, Cary. If we could extend to them the changes, that would be great.
Yep. I just want to be clear. They know that Wake County knows that invitation is coming. I knew it was in flux, so have the same information to share with them after I share with you. I'm happy to provide that courtesy to Cary if that's what
Please
council
do,
wants.
Yeah. A few of them wanted to go.
It's free. Anybody can come.
Also, perhaps our legislative delegation might enjoy the opportunity to join us. Thank you. Any other comments? Seeing none, I'd entertain Councilmember Wendell.
I do have a couple general ones real quick, sir. There was a question brought up to me today by a couple of people with regard to the state of the town meeting this morning. The concern was that it was $47 for a private citizen to attend. And the question was, why did private citizens have to pay $47 to be able to attend a state of the town? So that was a question that was asked of me to ask, I assume, the town.
So this is not a town event. This is a Chamber of Commerce event. And the way I think they work with their membership is even their business members pay fees for the events that they support. I don't have an answer about the cost or anything, and I'm happy to provide more information. But we are invited to participate, but it's a Morrisville Chamber of Commerce event. So I'd have to get you more information other than that.
Okay.
Councilmember Wendell, are these items that could maybe be taken offline or do during next council comments? Because we generally don't go into this kind of stuff during a work session.
So we can't ask questions of things? I'm sorry. It's just something we generally don't do during these work sessions, but. Okay. I just had one other thing, just because time is of the essence, I think.
Okay, sure.
And it's going to take a little bit of time before we get into the next one. I'd like to ask the town staff if we can review the current property that is owned by the town and then land that is privately held that is in line for the construction of the Town Hall Drive extension. The reason I ask is to determine if the town has a permanent option to build a roadway extension from Town Hall Drive to Crabtree Crossing, irrespective of it appearing on a map. Because if we don't have to put it on the map, if we have right-of-way of that land for now and all eternity, regardless of whether or not it appears on the map, future governments could potentially build that land or build a bridge or a roadway. So I don't know what is required to do that research. So that's why I wanted to ask for that research ahead of time.
Okay, thank you very much. Any comments from staff on that? Okay, Thank you very much. I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? It is 9:50, and we are adjourned. Thank you all, and thank you, staff, for moving us through those so nicely. Thank you. Have a nice day.